Take that rifle away from her." The room went dead silent. 12 soldiers turned to stare. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Staff Sergeant Claire Maddox didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe wrong. She just stood there holding a weapon she had qualified on 3 times over in a room full of men who had already decided she didn't belong. And one of them had just said it out loud, in front of everyone, into a microphone that was still live. Nobody corrected him. 9 days later, that same man would be screaming her name into a radio, begging her to take a shot nobody else on earth could make. If this story already has you hooked, I want you to stick with me all the way to the end. Hit like, subscribe, so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first thing people noticed about Claire Maddox was what she wasn't. She wasn't loud. Wasn't the kind of soldier who walked into a room and immediately started marking territory with her voice. She didn't tell stories about herself at the chow table or drop her accomplishments into casual conversation the way some people did, casually, like they were just checking the weather. She had a stillness to her that some people found professional and others found unsettling. And the difference between those two groups usually came down to whether they felt threatened by a person who didn't need their approval to function. She was 31 years old, 5'7", with hands that were rougher than most people expected, and eyes that spent more time calculating than emoting. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow from a training accident 3 years earlier that she never explained and nobody asked about twice. Her record was clean. Her qualification scores were exceptional. Her evaluations read like a checklist of everything you wanted in a precision marksman: disciplined, methodical, emotionally regulated under stress, capable of sustained focus during extended observation periods. None of that mattered. The morning Lieutenant Nathan Cross walked into the forward operating base at Kesler Station and looked at her like she was furniture someone had moved into the wrong room. Kesler Station sat in the crease between 2 mountain ridgelines about 40 kilometers from the Sable Ridge Valley, which was what the maps called it, and what nobody who actually operated there ever called it again after their first week. Soldiers who'd run patrols through that terrain called it the grinder, the throat, the slot, names that came from experience rather than cartography. The valley was a natural funnel, steep on both sides, with drainage channels that filled with loose rock and shadow even at midday. Sightlines were deceptive. Distance played tricks. The wind shifted in patterns that didn't match the trees because the trees had been destroyed years earlier by a combination of fire, ordnance, and neglect, leaving only stripped trunks that looked like broken teeth against the ridge. It was the kind of terrain that rewarded patience and punished assumptions. Claire had been at Kesler for 6 weeks before Cross arrived. She'd come in with the advance element of her unit, spent the first 10 days getting oriented, running familiarization patrols, building a picture of the ground. She had filled 2 notebooks with sketches, ridgeline profiles, engagement distance estimates, wind behavior at different times of day, areas where the terrain created dead ground that wouldn't show on overhead imagery. She had flagged 3 potential enemy firing positions to the outgoing intelligence officer, who had logged them, filed them, and never followed up. When Cross took command of the operations section, he inherited those logs. He also inherited Claire, which was clearly not something he had anticipated. She was at her workstation when he came through on his initial walk-around, the kind of first day in command tour where everything is assessment and nothing is casual. He stopped at her position, looked at the notebooks stacked on the corner of her desk, looked at the topographic printouts she had taped to the wall with annotated range cards beside them. Then he looked at her, and something moved across his face that she had seen before. Not surprise exactly, more like recalculation, the expression of a person adjusting an expectation and not being pleased about what the adjustment revealed. "Sergeant Maddox," he said. It wasn't a question, but it had the texture of one. "Sir." She stood, measured, not rushed. He looked at the wall again. "What is all this?" "Threat assessment, potential enemy positions I've identified based on ground observation and pattern analysis over the past 6 weeks. He picked up one of the range cards, studied it for a moment with the body language of someone who had already made up his mind but was performing the appearance of consideration. Set it back down. "Have these been reviewed by S2? "I submitted reports to the previous intelligence officer. They were logged but not actioned." "Right." He nodded slowly, like he was filing that information in a specific drawer. I'll take a look. He never did. The friction started small, the way it usually did. The first week, Cross reorganized the duty roster in a way that pulled Claire off the precision rifle section's training schedule and put her on a communications duty that was supposed to be filled by a soldier with half her qualification level. She said nothing. She did the comm duty. She also maintained her own training schedule in the hours before morning formation, running dry fire drills in the range shed at 0500 when nobody else was there. Sergeant Owen Briggs saw her once, coming in from a perimeter check at the end of his own early shift. He stopped in the doorway of the range shed and watched her for a moment. The deliberate, precise routine of a person who practiced not for show, but because she genuinely believed the gap between a good shot and a catastrophic miss lived in the 10,000 repetitions you did before anyone was watching. "You always up this early?" he asked. "Usually." He leaned against the door frame. Briggs was 43, built like someone who had started out lean and then added weight in all the right places over 20 years of military service. He had a face that had been sunburned and windburned so many times it had settled into a kind of permanent reddish brown that made him look permanently slightly irritated, even when he wasn't. "Cross move you off the sniper rotation?" She kept her eyes on her dry fire target, pressed the trigger. "Technically, I'm still on the rotation. But the training schedule he published has me at communications 3 days out of 5. Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then, "You know your score from the last qualification?" "He has access to my record." "That's not what I asked." She finally lowered the rifle, looked at him. "I don't know what he knows or doesn't know, Sergeant. I just know what I can control." Briggs studied her for another few seconds with the look of a person running a private calculation. Then he pushed off the doorframe. "Keep doing what you're doing," he said, and left. The second week, Cross held a patrol planning brief for the upcoming Sable Ridge reconnaissance mission. The purpose was straightforward: push a 12-man element into the valley to assess enemy activity levels, gather imagery, and confirm or deny the intelligence picture that had been building over the past month. The brief was efficient, competently structured, and almost entirely wrong in one critical area. Claire raised her hand. "Sir, I have a concern about the route on the Eastern Traverse." Cross looked at her. The room was full. 3 squad leaders, the operations sergeant major, the fires officer, 2 intelligence analysts. Everyone shifted slightly. "What kind of concern?" "The proposed route puts the patrol element in a low ground position for approximately 800 meters, directly beneath a ridgeline shelf that I've been tracking. I believe there's been enemy activity there consistent with mortar crew preparation. If they've moved a tube into that shelf, anyone in the low ground on that eastern traverse is completely exposed and inside minimum safe distance before they'd even know the crew was there." Cross let the sentence finish. Then he looked at his intelligence officer, a young captain named Foss, who had been at Kesler for 3 weeks. "Captain Foss, what does the current picture show for that ridgeline?" Foss pulled up his tablet. "Latest imagery from 48 hours ago shows no crew-served weapons and no significant digging activity. S2 assessment is routine patrol activity, low threat. 48 hours is enough time to move a mortar team and set it up," Claire said. She kept her voice flat. "No edge, no frustration. The terrain in that shelf creates a natural concealment corridor. Overhead imagery won't show preparation activity until the weapon is actually emplaced." Cross looked at her for a moment. "Your assessment is based on what exactly?" "Ground observation, pattern analysis over 6 weeks. I've tracked changes in movement behavior in that sector, so timing shifts, directional changes, duration variations. It's consistent with the crew establishing a firing position." "You've tracked this personally?" "Yes, sir." He picked up his briefing folder. "I appreciate the input, Sergeant. We'll note it. The route stands." She sat down. The room had that particular quality of air that settles after someone has said an uncomfortable thing and everyone is pretending it was only slightly uncomfortable rather than deeply uncomfortable. The operations sergeant major, a woman named Valdez, who had been doing this job for 16 years, caught Claire's eye for exactly 1 second. Her expression communicated nothing specific and somehow communicated everything. After the brief broke up, Briggs fell in beside Claire in the hallway. "You want to find a different approach," he said quietly. "What approach would that be?" "Not sure yet, but the route doesn't have to be the route." She thought about that. What Briggs meant, she understood 2 days later, when he revised the patrol's internal movement plan without formally changing the approved route. On paper, the element would move through the eastern traverse as planned. In practice, Briggs arranged the file order and positioning so that the element's heaviest firepower was oriented toward the ridgeline shelf she'd flagged, and so that Claire would be at a position in the file from which she would have the clearest possible angle to that shelf if anything happened. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't a proper solution. It was a man with 20 years of experience quietly acknowledging that a younger soldier's concern had merit, even if the chain of command had chosen not to formally recognize it, and doing what he could within the limits of his authority to hedge against the worst case. He told her about it the night before the patrol stepped off. They were in the equipment bay, checking gear. She was torquing her scope mounts, running through a ritual she had performed so many times it had become almost meditative. "I moved your position in the file," he said. She kept working. "I noticed the revised element order. You'll have the angle. If something's there," he zipped his kit bag. "For what it's worth, I read your reports from the first 6 weeks, the ones you gave to the previous S2. She looked up. "You were right about the 2 positions you flagged in the southern corridor. Enemy used both of them after we moved out of that sector." He hoisted the kit bag onto his shoulder. "Just wanted you to know someone read them." She didn't say anything for a moment, then, "Thank you, Sergeant." "Don't thank me. Just be ready." The night before deployment, she couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. Pre-operation insomnia was something she had learned to manage rather than fight. Lying in the dark with her eyes open, running through scenarios, mapping contingencies, letting her brain do what her brain needed to do until it exhausted itself enough to give her 2 or 3 hours of functional rest. She had learned to treat sleeplessness as a tool rather than a problem. What she did instead of sleeping was math. She pulled out her dope book, a battered green notebook she had been adding to for 7 years, dense with range data, atmospheric corrections, and personal notes on how her rifle performed under specific conditions. And she started working through the problem set she had been building since she first identified the ridgeline shelf as a potential threat. She calculated firing solutions for engagements from multiple points along the patrol route to the shelf position, factoring in the altitude differential, the expected wind behavior at that time of morning, the temperature at the projected patrol time, the density-altitude correction for the ammunition lot she was carrying. The numbers that kept coming back were uncomfortable. At the distance she was calculating, between 1,700 and 1,900 meters, depending on exactly where an enemy crew emplaced on that shelf, she was operating beyond the published maximum effective range of her weapon system. Not by a little. By a margin that most instructors would look at and call theoretical at best and irresponsible at worst. She wrote the numbers down anyway. Worked through the ballistic arc, the time of flight, the bullet drop at extreme range, the wind drift coefficient at different velocity estimates. Checked the calculations twice, changed one variable, ran them again. She could make the shot. At certain angles, under specific conditions, with no margin for error, she could make it. Whether she would ever need to was a different question. Whether anyone would let her try was an entirely different question after that. She closed the notebook at 300 and stared at the ceiling for another hour. Dawn at Kesler Station came sideways. Not the clean sunrise of lower elevations, but a gradual, grudging lightening of a sky that was always partially obscured by the ridgelines. The kind of morning where you put your hand in front of your face and could see it before you could see anything else. The patrol element assembled at 0445 in the equipment staging area. 12 soldiers, full kit, faces tight with the particular focus of people about to go somewhere that didn't forgive mistakes. Claire checked her gear for the 4th time out of discipline rather than need. Ammunition verified, optic properly zeroed, backup gear staged, radio checked and checked again. She wore no expression that would give anyone around her a reading on what she was thinking. Cross appeared at 0455, did a quick walk down of the element, and stopped at her position in the file. "Sergeant Maddox." He looked at where she was positioned. Something flickered across his face. Awareness that her place in the file had changed from the original order, but he said nothing about it. "Sir, you're clear on your role today?" "Yes, sir. Overwatch and precision engagement if required." He held eye contact for a beat longer than necessary. Then he moved on. Briggs was 6 positions ahead of her in the file. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. They stepped off at 0500 into the thin cold of early morning, single file, into the dark mountain terrain where the Sable Ridge Valley waited like something that had been patient for a very long time. Movement through the approach corridor took 90 minutes of careful, disciplined work. The terrain was exactly what Claire had been tracking from maps and observation. Rough, ankle-turning ground with loose rock that shifted under pressure. Drainage channels that filled with shadow and made it impossible to judge depth. Sparse vegetation that provided concealment in some places, and none at all in others. The patrol moved in the practiced rhythm of a unit that had done this enough times to have internalized the muscle memory. Intervals maintained, noise discipline respected, movement paused at irregular intervals to listen. Claire moved and listened and watched and counted distance and tracked their position relative to the ridgeline shelf simultaneously. It was a kind of split attention that she had developed over years. The mechanical awareness of immediate surroundings running in one track, while the tactical picture ran in another, both accessible without conscious effort, neither interrupting the other. The eastern traverse began at the 70-minute mark. The valley opened here in a way that felt deceptively spacious after the confined approach. The floor was wider, the ridgelines further back on both sides, the sky more visible. It was the kind of terrain that made soldiers unconsciously relax their spacing because the ground felt less threatening. That instinct was wrong. More open ground meant longer exposure, less cover, and the ridgeline shelf was directly ahead on the left, at a distance that Claire estimated at approximately 1,840 meters from her current position in the file, slightly further than her most conservative calculation from the previous night. She felt it before she saw it. A change in the quality of silence, a shift in the way her peripheral attention was registering the terrain on the shelf. Not a specific detail, but an accumulation of small details. The way experienced soldiers talked about sixth sense and actually meant the subconscious integration of data the conscious mind hadn't cataloged yet. She pulled up her scope, settled her breathing, found the shelf. At first it was nothing, rock and shadow and the stripped remnants of a dead scrub line. Then one shadow moved independent of the others, and she realized the shadow was a person, and behind that person was the cylindrical profile of something that absolutely was not rock. Her voice stayed flat, controlled, pitched to carry, to Briggs and the patrol leader at the front of the file without being audible at distance. Contact. Ridgeline shelf. Left, 1,840 meters. Mortar crew. Crew-served weapon visible. They're setting up. The element froze. Cross was on the radio immediately. Higher, Kesler actual. We have visual contact with enemy crew-served weapon, possible mortar position. Grid follows. He rattled the grid coordinates from his display. Static. Then a response requiring identification verification, then confirmation, then a request for battle damage assessment estimate, which was the kind of bureaucratic rhythm that real-time tactical situations had no patience for. Claire kept her eye on the scope. The crew had 3 members visible now. One was steadying the bipod. One was unloading cylindrical ammunition cases. The third was establishing an observation position with what appeared to be a ranging device. "They're loading," she said. "Stand by," Cross said. He was still working the radio. Briggs had moved up the file. He was beside Cross now, low, close, voice controlled. "Sir, if they drop around into this traverse, the entire element is in the kill zone. I'm aware of that, Sergeant. We need to move or we need to engage. We are not authorized for unilateral fire without higher confirmation." The metallic sound carried even at distance. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a precise mechanical click and thunk that Claire had learned to recognize in training and never wanted to hear in the field. They had chambered around. "Sir?" Her voice was still level. "They have loaded. First round is in the tube. Time to first impact at this distance and arc. 45 seconds from launch, maybe 60. Cross had gone very still. Briggs said quietly, "Sir, make the call." The radio crackled. Higher was asking for clarification on the authentication code for the fire request. Cross looked at Claire. She was already settled, scope to eye, breathing controlled. She had not moved from the position she'd been building for the last 90 seconds. weight distributed, rifle stable against the natural terrain brace she'd found in the rock she was using for support, scope dialed to the solution she'd calculated and recalculated and run through again at 0300 this morning. "Can you make the shot?" Cross's voice was different now. The authority was still there, but the certainty underneath it was gone, replaced by something rawer. She said, "Yes." One word. No performance, no hedging. He stared at her for 2 full seconds that probably felt much longer to him than they did to her. Then, "Take it." The wind at that moment was moving left to right, estimated at 6 to 8 knots based on the vegetation motion she had been monitoring for the last 4 minutes. She had already adjusted her hold. The bullet would travel 1,840 meters, drop significantly in the arc, drift right with the crosswind. Time of flight at that distance was approximately 2.7 seconds. In 2.7 seconds, a standing human target could move a significant distance. She needed the target to be still or to be still enough. The enemy crew commander was standing upright, back to her, focused entirely on his observation device. She let out half a breath, held the rest. The trigger was not pulled. It was pressed, slowly, without anticipation, the break happening when it happened rather than when she forced it. Every repetition of every dry fire drill at 0500 in the range shed had been practiced for exactly this. The complete absence of the flinch that comes from wanting the shot to go before it's ready. The rifle fired. The sound was enormous and then gone, swallowed by the valley. She kept the scope on target, watched the 2.7 seconds. They were the longest 2.7 seconds she had experienced in 31 years, and she had experienced some long seconds. The enemy commander dropped. Not stumbled, not reacted. Dropped. The instantaneous collapse of a nervous system receiving no further instructions. There and then, not there in the space between one frame and the next. The remaining 2 crew members stared at each other for exactly 1 second. Then they ran. They left the weapon, left the ammunition, left their commander in the dirt on the ridgeline shelf, and they ran. And Claire tracked them in the scope but did not fire, because they were no longer a threat, and that was the difference between a marksman and something else. The patrol was silent. She lowered the rifle. Her hands were steady. Her heartbeat was elevated but not uncontrolled. She felt, in a distant way, the particular quality of post-engagement stillness that was different from pre-engagement tension. The same, quiet but emptied out, like a room after a storm. Nobody said anything for several seconds. Then a voice from somewhere in the file, she couldn't tell whose, said low and almost to itself, "Holy." Cross was standing behind her. She heard him exhale, a long, unsteady breath, the kind that happens when a person realizes how close something came. Briggs knelt beside her. "You okay?" "I'm okay." He looked out toward the shelf, looked back at her. Something moved across his face that was complicated and quiet and genuine. "Good shot," he said. It wasn't enough, and it was exactly enough. And she nodded once and started the process of logging what had just happened in her head the way she logged everything, precisely, sequentially, without embellishment. Higher confirmed contact over the radio. Cross gave the brief report. The patrol consolidated and began the process of repositioning out of the low ground to a more defensible intermediate position before continuing the mission. They were professional about it. They moved well. Nobody made a scene. But as they moved, she noticed the way the other soldiers were looking at her. Not the look from the operations room when Cross had said, "Take that rifle away from her." Not the flat assessment of skeptics checking boxes. Something different, quieter. The particular look of people who have just watched something rewrite what they thought they understood about what was possible. She didn't let herself feel it yet. There would be time later, maybe, to let it land. Right now, there were still 8 kilometers between the patrol and the base, and the valley didn't care what had just happened on the ridgeline shelf. The terrain was still rough, and the shadows were still deceptive, and the wind was still shifting in patterns that would fool anyone who wasn't paying attention. She paid attention. Set. The patrol returned to Kesler Station at 1340, 14 minutes ahead of the planned timeline. The debrief was scheduled for 1500, and mandatory attendance was confirmed via radio while they were still on movement. What Claire did not know, what she could not have anticipated, was that by the time she sat down in that debrief room, someone had already started editing her out of the story. The after-action report was being drafted in real time. Cross had his operations sergeant working on it during the patrol's exfil. She would find out later, through Briggs, that the draft had already circulated twice in the 2 hours before the debrief. Her name did not appear in it once. Not once. What appeared instead was the phrase, "the designated marksman," deployed 14 times across the report's 5 sections, as if the shot had been fired by a category rather than a human being, as if a function had performed a function and there was no person attached to either end of it. She didn't know that yet when she walked into the debrief. She was still thinking about the math. She was still replaying the 2.7 seconds, checking her own recall against what she'd observed, logging inconsistencies for future reference. She was still, in the part of her brain that never fully stood down, calculating what she could have done differently and what she would do again exactly the same way. She sat down in the debrief room. Cross stood at the front. The slides were already on the screen. She read the first slide and her name was not on it. She read the second slide. Not there. She read the third. The sentence under the incident log read, "The designated marksman engaged and neutralized the enemy crew commander at 1,840 meters, disrupting the mortar crew's fire mission and enabling the patrol to extract without casualties." She read it twice. Then she set her pen down on the table very quietly, and she sat very still, and she looked at the front of the room where Lieutenant Nathan Cross was preparing to brief the results of an engagement that she had spent 6 weeks predicting, 1 sleepless night calculating, and 2.7 seconds executing. He had not said her name yet. She was starting to understand that he might not. The briefing slides kept moving. Cross worked through them with the practiced efficiency of someone who had given 100 after-action reports and knew the rhythm. Incident summary, timeline, engagement assessment, lessons learned, recommendations. His voice was steady and measured and professional. He used words like element and force and designated marksman, and he said none of them wrong technically. Every sentence was accurate in the way that a photograph with the subject cropped out is still technically a photograph. Claire sat at the third seat from the left on the near side of the table and kept her face neutral and read every slide twice and counted, 14 times. By the end of the brief, the phrase designated marksman appeared 14 times in the slides and in the verbal summary that Cross delivered alongside them. Each time he said it, she heard the shape of the omission, not an accident, not an oversight, but a choice, repeated 14 times, which meant it was not a choice at all. It was a policy. Nobody in the room said her name either. The Operations Sergeant Major Valdez sat at the end of the table with a legal pad and wrote notes in a precise, compressed hand without looking up. The fires officer asked 2 technical questions about the engagement geometry, and Cross answered them using information that Claire had provided during the patrol debrief. Her range estimate, her wind call, her time of flight assessment, and attributed none of it to her. Captain Foss, the intelligence officer whose 48-hour-old imagery had missed the mortar crew entirely, asked no questions at all. Briggs sat across the table from Claire. At some point during the 4th slide, he looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the exchange lasted less than 2 seconds, but communicated something precise and mutual. An acknowledgement that what was happening in this room was wrong, and that neither of them had the authority in this moment to stop it. When Cross opened the floor for questions, Claire raised her hand. He looked at her. Something tightened slightly around his eyes. Sergeant Maddox. Sir, the report references the designated marksman in the engagement summary. Can you confirm the permanent record will reflect the individual's name and unit role for documentation purposes? The room's ambient noise, the hum of the ventilation, the distant sound of a vehicle outside, seemed to get louder in the pause that followed. After-action reports document functional roles, Cross said. That's standard format. For administrative reports, yes, sir. My understanding is that engagement logs and significant action reports identify individuals by name for the permanent record. Your understanding? That's correct, sir. Cross held her gaze for a moment. His expression had the particular quality of a person choosing between 2 responses and selecting the one that was technically defensible rather than the one that was honest. I'll review the documentation standards, he said. Anything else? She said no, sir, and wrote nothing on her own pad because there was nothing left to write. The debrief room cleared out in the way rooms clear after tense meetings, quickly, with a general mutual agreement not to acknowledge what had just been sitting in the air for the last 40 minutes. Soldiers found reasons to look at their phones or talk to the person next to them or move toward the door with purpose. Valdez gathered her legal pad and left without making eye contact with anyone. Briggs waited until the room was almost empty. Then he pulled a chair up beside Claire, turned it backwards, and sat on it the way he always sat on chairs, straddling the back, forearms resting on the top rail. "You okay?" he said. "You keep asking me that. You keep giving me reasons to." She was looking at the blank projection screen at the front of the room. The slides were gone, just the white rectangle of an empty display. "I'm fine, Sergeant." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "What you did out there today was my job. Was significantly beyond your job." He said it flatly, without inflation. "And they know it. That's the problem." She turned to look at him. "What do you mean that's the problem?" Briggs rubbed the back of his neck. He had the expression of a man choosing his words carefully, not because he didn't know what he wanted to say, but because he wanted to say it accurately. Some people can handle being shown up by someone they underestimated. They recalibrate. They give credit. He paused. Cross isn't one of those people. He gave the order. He gave the order because he had no other options, and 12 of his soldiers were about to get killed. That's different from deciding you deserve the credit. Briggs stood up, put the chair back. "You need to go through Valdez." She was in the room. She was in the room and she wrote it all down. Valdez doesn't miss things. She's been doing this since before Cross was in uniform. He moved toward the door, then stopped. "Don't go directly at Cross on this. You won't win that fight, and you'll spend the rest of your time here paying for it." She thought about that. Thought about the 14 instances of designated marksmen on a slide deck that would be filed in a system and read by people who would have no way of knowing there was a person behind the phrase. "What happened to my reports?" she said. "The 6 weeks of threat assessments I submitted before this patrol?" Briggs stopped. "They were logged," she said. "The previous S2 logged them, which means there's a record of when they were submitted. Which means there's a record that I identified that ridgeline shelf 9 days before this patrol went out." He turned around slowly. His expression had changed. "If those reports are in the system," she said, "then the record shows that the designated marksman also predicted the threat, documented it, briefed it, and was dismissed." Briggs looked at her for a long moment. "You'd need someone with access to pull those logs." "Yes." "Valdez has access." "Yes." He was very still. Then he made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Something shorter and drier than that. "You were already thinking about this." "I was thinking about it during the last 4 kilometers of Exfil," she said. "I had time." She found Valdez in the operations center at 1730, which was where Valdez always was at 1730, because Valdez operated on a schedule that the rest of the world adjusted to rather than the reverse. The operations center was a low-ceiling space full of monitors and map boards, and the particular smell of recycled air and dry erase markers that was universal to every tactical operations center Claire had ever been in, regardless of theater or location. Valdez looked up when Claire came in. She was the only person in the immediate space. The battle captain was at the far end of the room working a radio update with his back turned. "Sergeant Maddox," Valdez said. Her voice gave nothing away. "Sergeant Major? Do you have a few minutes?" Valdez set down her pen, leaned back slightly in her chair, the kind of lean that said she was listening without committing to anything else yet. Claire put her notebook on the desk. Not her dope book, a different one. The administrative notebook she kept with dates and cross-references and submission records going back to her first week at Kesler. She opened it to the page she'd tabbed before walking over. "I submitted 6 threat assessment reports between day 3 and day 38 of my time here," she said. "They were received and logged by the previous S2 officer. The last one, submitted on day 38, specifically identified the ridgeline shelf in Sector 47 as a probable enemy mortar position. That report was logged 9 days before today's patrol." Valdez looked at the notebook. She didn't touch it. "I'm not going over Lieutenant Cross's head," Claire said. "I'm not filing a complaint. I'm asking whether the documentation standard for significant action reports requires individual identification and whether there's a mechanism to ensure that preliminary intelligence that directly predicted today's engagement is included in the permanent record." Valdez was quiet for a long moment. The battle captain at the far end of the room said something into his handset, and laughed at the response. "What do you want the outcome to be?" Valdez asked. "I want the record to be accurate." "That's the answer you'd give in an interview." Claire paused. "I want the 12 soldiers who came home today to know that someone predicted this and tried to stop it from happening. I want the people who ignored that prediction to understand what that cost, even though today it didn't cost anything, because it almost did." She stopped, tried to find the edge of the sentence. "And yes, I want my name on the report, because I was there and I took the shot and I've been doing this job for 7 years and I'm tired of being a category." Valdez held her gaze without moving. Then she picked up the notebook. "Read the entry Claire had indicated. Read it again." "I'll pull the submission logs from the previous S2's files," she said. "Routine records maintenance. I do it monthly." She set the notebook back down. "That's a separate process from the after-action report, which will be reviewed by Battalion before it's filed." "I understand. Battalion reviews happen within 72 hours. "I understand," Claire said again. Valdez picked up her pen. "Is there anything else, Sergeant?" "No, Sergeant Major." "Then you're dismissed." Claire picked up her notebook and left. She didn't let herself feel anything in the corridor because the corridor was not a place for feelings, and also because she wasn't sure yet what she felt, whether it was closer to relief or anger or something that didn't have a clean name, some compound of the two that came from spending a day doing something extraordinary and then spending the evening defending the right to have done it. She went back to her quarters, sat on the edge of her cot, looked at the wall. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady. Whatever the rest of her was doing, her hands had decided to hold it together. The base had a rhythm at night that was different from its daytime pulse, quieter, more internal, the sound of a place that never fully stopped but shifted registers after dark. Generators hummed, occasional vehicle movement, the distant exchange of a radio check somewhere across the wire. Claire was at her workstation at 2100 updating her personal engagement log, the unofficial one she kept in her dope book alongside the firing data, because she had learned years earlier that personal records and official records were not always the same document, and it was important to know what you knew independent of what the system said you knew. She was midway through recording the atmospheric conditions at the time of the shot when Specialist Reyes knocked on the open doorframe of the workspace. Reyes was 24, one of the younger soldiers in the element, with a face that still registered surprise more visibly than experience would eventually teach him to suppress. He'd been on the patrol, third position in the file, which put him close enough to the front to hear Cross on the radio, but far enough back that he hadn't had a direct line of sight to the ridgeline shelf. "Sergeant Maddox?" "Reyes." He came in a few steps, stopped. He had something in his hand, a folded piece of paper, which he held with both hands the way people hold things they're uncertain about delivering. "I wanted to—" He stopped, tried again. "What you did today, out there." "It was my job." "No." He said it with a directness that surprised her. "I've seen a lot of qualification shoots. I've seen a lot of guys who are good. What you did today was not the same thing." He looked at the paper in his hands. "My buddy, Martinez, he was second position in the file. If that crew had gotten that round off, Martinez was in the kill zone." She said nothing. "He's got a kid," Reyes said. 8 months old, never met her yet." The room was quiet. Outside, a generator cycled through a minor variation in its hum and settled back. "I just wanted to say thank you," Reyes said. "From me. I don't know if anyone official is going to say it." He put the folded paper on the desk beside her notebook. Then he turned and left before she could respond, which she appreciated more than he probably knew, because the appropriate response in that moment was not one she trusted herself to deliver without some piece of it cracking. She looked at the paper for a while before she opened it. When she did, it was a handwritten note on the back of a patrol briefing sheet, a few lines in the cramped, slightly lopsided handwriting of someone who didn't do a lot of writing by hand. It said, "Today you saved 12 soldiers. Whatever they put in the report doesn't change that. We know." It was signed by 9 names. She read the list twice, folded the paper, put it inside the back cover of her dope book, between the cover and the last page where it would stay flat. Then she went back to logging the atmospheric conditions at the time of the shot, because the record mattered even if the official version didn't have her name in it yet. The next morning was harder. Not because anything dramatic happened, it was almost the opposite. The base resumed its regular rhythm with the kind of institutional amnesia that sets in quickly in high-tempo environments where yesterday's near catastrophe becomes today's historical footnote, because there's always something new demanding present tense attention. Patrols went out, reports came in. The operations center ran its cycles. Cross held his morning brief at 700 and referenced the previous day's engagement in one sentence under significant activities and moved on. Claire was back on communications duty. The roster that Cross published at 0630 had her scheduled for comm duty for the next 3 days. Same as before the patrol, same as before the engagement, same as before a shot that by any reasonable measure should have triggered some adjustment in how her skills were being deployed. Nothing had changed on paper. The unofficial record inside the base, the knowledge that moved person to person through the informal network of soldiers who had been there or heard from someone who had, that was different. But the official structure hadn't moved. She reported to comm duty at 0745 and ran radio checks and logged traffic and monitored frequencies and did the job competently and without complaint because competence and the absence of complaint were the only two weapons she currently had reliable access to. Around 1100, Cross came through the comm section. He did a brief walkthrough of the space, the kind of supervisory movement that was about presence rather than specific inspection. He stopped at her station. "How's the traffic today?" "Manageable, sir. 2 scheduling conflicts on the morning patrol net that I coordinated through. Nothing significant." He nodded. He was about to move on. Then he didn't. "Sergeant Maddox." He said it with a different weight than the previous times. "Sir?" "Yesterday." He stopped. His jaw moved slightly, like he was working through something. "What you did, the level of preparation that required, the calculations. Part of the job, sir." "It's not, though." He said it quietly. Not an argument, more like an admission he hadn't quite planned. "Not at that range, not with those conditions." She waited. He looked at a point somewhere past her left shoulder. "I've been putting you on comm duty because I thought..." Another stop. He was not a man who edited himself in real time with any grace. "I had a picture of what this section needed, and I slotted people into it. I may have been working off the wrong picture in some cases." The generality of some cases was doing considerable work in that sentence, and they both knew it. "I appreciate that, sir," she said. "I'm not..." He paused. "I'm not saying it's fixed. I'm saying I'm aware there's an issue." "Understood, sir." He looked at her then, directly, not the practiced look of a commander inspecting a subordinate, but the less comfortable look of a person actually seeing another person, and not being entirely sure what to do with what they were seeing. He left without saying anything else. She watched him go, turned back to the radio, logged the traffic from the 1100 check, kept her face entirely neutral and her internal reading of that conversation entirely private, because she had been in the Army long enough to know the difference between a man who was reconsidering something and a man who had actually changed, and those were 2 different men with 2 different records of what happened next. The battalion review arrived at Kesler Station 36 hours after the patrol. It came in the form of a 2-person team from Battalion S3, a major named Whitfield and a master sergeant named Okafor, who arrived at 0900, asked for a quiet space to review documentation, and spent 3 hours in the conference room with the after-action report, the radio transcripts, and the submission logs that Valdez had pulled as part of her routine records maintenance. Claire was not summoned. She was on range maintenance duty, which was where Cross's revised roster put her that day, and she spent the morning in the range shed cleaning equipment and running the kind of maintenance work that needed doing regardless of whatever else was happening in the administration building 40 meters away. Briggs found her at 11:15. He came into the range shed and sat on an ammunition crate and watched her work for about 30 seconds before he said anything. "Valdez briefed Whitfield this morning." She kept working. "Routine briefing? With her logs and your submission records from the previous 6 weeks." He paused. "And with the radio transcript from the patrol." She stopped. "Apparently the transcript is pretty clear," Briggs said. "Cross comes up on the net, requests fire authorization from Higher asks for authentication. There's about 90 seconds of dead air while the mortar crew is loading, and then you hear Cross say, He looked at her. Quote, Sergeant Maddox, take the shot. The range shed was very quiet. 4 words, Briggs said. 4 words in a radio transcript that's been sitting in the system for 36 hours. Did Whitfield pull it himself, or did Valdez give it to him? Valdez included it in the records package she provided for the review. Routine documentation. He said the last 2 words with a very slight emphasis, not enough to qualify as sarcasm exactly. What happens now? Whitfield's been in that conference room for 3 hours. Briggs looked at the rifle parts on the bench in front of her. My read is he's not someone who tolerates a record that doesn't match a transcript. She reassembled the bolt assembly, checked the function, set it down. What does Cross know? I'd guess he knows Whitfield is here. I'd guess he knows why. He shifted on the ammunition crate. He looked like he hadn't slept when I saw him at the morning brief. She thought about the conversation at the comm station. The partial admission that hadn't quite made it to the surface. The 4 words in the radio transcript that apparently had. Is there anything I need to do? She asked. Be available if they want to talk to you, Briggs said. Be accurate if they ask questions. That's it. He stood up. The truth's already in the system, Maddox. That's the thing about radio transcripts. They don't get edited after the fact. He left. She went back to the maintenance work. At 1340, a runner came to the range shed with a message requesting her presence in the conference room. She put down what she was working on, washed her hands, checked her uniform in the small mirror mounted on the shed wall. Habit more than vanity, the kind of thing you did before any official interaction, regardless of how much or how little you cared about the interaction. She walked the 40 meters to the administration building. The conference room door was open. Major Whitfield sat at the head of the table with a printed document in front of him. She could see the header from the doorway, the standard form header of a significant action report. Master Sergeant Okafor sat to his right with a laptop. Valdez sat along the wall, not at the table. Her legal pad was in her lap. Cross was not in the room. Sergeant Maddox, Whitfield said. Have a seat. She sat at the near end of the table. Whitfield looked at her for a moment with the evaluative calm of someone who processed a lot of people in official settings and had developed the ability to take a reading quickly without broadcasting it. I've been reviewing the after-action documentation from yesterday's patrol, he said. I've also reviewed a set of preliminary intelligence reports submitted prior to the operation, and I've listened to the radio transcript from the engagement timeline. He set the document down. I have a few questions, and I want to be clear that this is an administrative review, not a formal inquiry. You are not in any kind of adverse proceeding. Understood, sir? The transcript from the patrol records a specific exchange at the time of the engagement decision. I want to confirm your recollection matches the recording. He read from a sheet in front of him. Cross asks, can you make the shot? You respond, yes. Cross then instructs, Sergeant Maddox, take the shot. Is that accurate? Yes, sir, that's accurate. And the shot was fired by you from the position Sergeant Briggs had arranged in the patrol file. Yes, sir. Whitfield made a note. Okafor typed something. The room was otherwise still. The preliminary reports, Whitfield said. The 6 threat assessments you submitted before this patrol. Did you believe, at the time of submission, that the ridgeline shelf you identified represented an active threat? Yes, sir. I believed it represented a probable threat with a high confidence level based on behavioral pattern analysis. And the report you submitted on day 38 specifically identified that shelf? Yes, sir. 9 days before the patrol? Yes, sir. Whitfield looked at the document in front of him for a moment. Then he looked up. His expression was the kind that was professionally neutral, with something very specific behind it. Thank you, Sergeant. That's all I need from you for now. He paused. One more thing. Is there anything you want to add to the record that hasn't been asked? She thought about it. Thought about the 14 instances of designated marksman. Thought about the comm duty roster. Thought about Martinez in the second position in the file with an 8-month-old daughter he hadn't met yet. No, sir, she said. The record speaks for itself. Whitfield nodded once. She stood, came to attention, and left the room. In the corridor, she walked past the operations section, where through the open door she could see Cross sitting at his desk. He was looking at his computer screen. He did not look up as she passed. She went back to the range shed. She had 2 more rifles to finish cleaning, and the work wasn't going to do itself. And keeping her hands busy was, at this point, the most honest thing she could think of to do while she waited to find out what version of the truth was going to end up in the permanent record. She picked up the next rifle and started at the beginning. The second rifle took 40 minutes. She worked through the disassembly with the methodical patience of someone who had learned to let her hands run on automatic while the rest of her mind did something else entirely. And what the rest of her mind was doing was running probability assessments on what Whitfield would put in his review and what that review would actually change, because those were two separate questions with two separate answer sets. And she had been in the Army long enough to know that the truth existing in a document and the truth having consequences were not the same event. The bolt came apart cleanly. She laid the components on the cleaning mat in order and started on the carbon buildup in the bolt carrier with a worn bronze brush that she should have replaced 2 weeks ago and hadn't gotten around to requesting yet. Small failures. The kind that accumulated when you were spending your mental bandwidth on things that should not have been requiring mental bandwidth. She was on the firing pin assembly when she heard the voices. Not loud. Not the raised volume of a confrontation. More the compressed, controlled intensity of people who were trying to keep something contained and not entirely succeeding. Coming from the direction of the administration building. She couldn't make out words, just the texture of the exchange. Two voices. Cadence suggesting argument, one of them higher and tighter than the other. She kept working, set the firing pin down, picked up the extractor. Briggs appeared in the rain shed doorway 11 minutes later. His expression was the particular arrangement of a man who had just seen something he'd half expected and hadn't fully wanted to be right about. "Whitfield found something else," he said. She looked up. The intelligence officer, Foss. Briggs came into the shed, not all the way, stopping about 2 meters in and crossing his arms. Turns out the imagery assessment he presented at the patrol brief, the one that said 48 hours was sufficient coverage and the ridgeline showed no threat indicators, that assessment wasn't fully his. She set the extractor down. He pulled a summary from a higher-level intelligence product that covered a broader sector. The specific ridgeline analysis in his brief came from that broader product's low-confidence section. Indicators present but insufficient for confirmation. He presented it as a clean negative. He simplified it. He gutted it, Briggs said. The original product flagged that shelf as a location of interest with a note that ground-level observation would be required for confidence improvement. Foss didn't include that caveat in his brief. She was quiet for a moment. Did Cross know? That's what Whitfield is currently asking Cross. She thought about this morning brief where she had raised her hand and Cross had looked at Foss and Foss had said low threat with the casual certainty of a man reading from a source that he'd already decided was conclusive. How did Whitfield find it? Valdez flagged the discrepancy. She pulled the original intelligence product as part of the records review and compared it against Foss's brief slides. Briggs shifted against the doorframe. Apparently Valdez has been in this business long enough that she reads source documents, not summaries. Of course she did. Valdez had been doing this since before Cross was commissioned and before Foss had learned to read a military map. She had probably identified the discrepancy within the first hour of the records review and spent the rest of the morning building the comparison in a way that would be impossible to dismiss. "What does this mean for the patrol record?" Claire asked. "It means the question of why your threat assessment was dismissed is now part of the story," Briggs said. "Not just whether you got credit for the shot, but whether the dismissal itself was a failure, an institutional one." He paused. Whitfield's language, when he came out of the conference room, was careful, but the word he used was accountability. She picked up the firing pin again, turned it over in her fingers. What happens to Foss? Unknown. What happens to Cross is also unknown. Briggs looked at the rifle components on the mat. What I do know is that Battalion doesn't send a 2-person review team and spend half a day in the conference room because they're satisfied with the paperwork. At 1600, Cross requested her presence in his office. Not through a runner this time. He came himself, appeared in the rain shed doorway with his cover under his arm, and his expression doing the careful work of a man trying to present a surface that didn't give away what was happening underneath it. "Sergeant Maddox, when you're at a stopping point," she looked at the rifle in her hands. She was at a stopping point. She set it down. His office was small and functional, the kind of space that accumulated paperwork faster than any single person could manage, with topographic maps pinned to the wall and a whiteboard covered in unit symbols, and a desk that had two good working surfaces, and one that had become a staging area for things that hadn't been filed yet. He closed the door behind her, which was unusual. She stood in the middle of the room and did not sit, because he hadn't invited her to sit, and she wasn't going to assume. He stood behind his desk without sitting either. "The battalion review is going to result in an amended after-action report," he said. "Your name will be included with full attribution for the engagement." "Thank you, sir." "That's not a favor. That's a correction." He said it with a flatness that she recognized as something genuine, the tone of a person making a distinction that mattered to them rather than performing humility. "I want to be clear about that." "Understood, sir." He looked at the desk, at a point on the desk, not at any specific thing on it. "The preliminary intelligence reports you submitted, the 6-week threat assessment series." He picked up a pen, not to write anything, just to have something in his hand. "I didn't read them." She waited. "I logged them, ensured they were transmitted to S2, but I didn't read them personally." He set the pen down. "I read them last night, after Whitfield's team arrived." The room held that. "Your assessment on day 38, he said. "The ridgeline shelf analysis, the movement pattern data." He stopped again. "You used a Fourier analysis approach on the timing variations." She hadn't expected him to say that. "I did, sir." "That's not in the standard threat assessment format." "No, sir. I adapted the methodology from signals intelligence analysis. It applies to behavioral patterns, the same way it applies to signal patterns. You're looking for non-random periodicity, indicators of coordinated preparation rather than casual activity." He was looking at her now. "Where did you learn that?" She paused. "I read, sir." It was the simplest true answer. She had spent 3 years reading every intelligence methodology document she could get her hands on, not because anyone had told her to, but because she had a certain kind of mind that reached for frameworks the way other people reached for tools. Analysis was just pattern recognition with rigor applied. She had figured that out early and spent a lot of time since then getting better at the rigor. Cross studied her for a moment. "I had a picture of who you were," he said, "and I worked from the picture instead of from the actual record." He stopped, started again. That's the honest version." "Yes, sir." "I'm not asking for absolution." "I wasn't offering it, sir." Something moved in his expression. Not offense, more like the particular impact of a sentence that lands precisely where it was aimed. "No," he said. "I know." She stood for another moment in the office with its topographic maps and its staged paperwork, and its whiteboard full of unit symbols that represented 12 people who had come home the day before. Then she said, "Is there anything else, sir?" He looked at her for one more beat. "No, you're dismissed." She left. In the corridor, she took a breath that was slightly longer than a normal breath and let it out and kept walking. The amended report was issued the following morning. She read it in the operations center when Valdez left a printed copy on the shared workstation without comment, which was Valdez's precise and characteristic method of communicating things she did not feel required verbal elaboration. Her name appeared 7 times. Staff Sergeant Claire Maddox, SSGC Maddox. Sergeant Maddox. 7 times in a document that had previously not contained her name once. She read it through completely, once, with the same attention she gave to range cards and intelligence products. Systematically, looking for accuracy, noting anything that required follow-up. It was accurate. The atmospheric conditions she'd logged matched the report's engagement summary. The range was correctly stated as 1,840 meters. The time of flight was noted as approximately 2.7 seconds, which matched her recall. The preliminary intelligence section referenced her 6-week threat assessment series and noted that her Day 38 submission had specifically identified the engagement location. She folded the copy and put it in her left cargo pocket. Then she went back to work. The base took about 2 days to fully absorb the revision. Official records moved at one speed, the informal network moved faster, and by the end of the first day after the amended report circulated, the understanding of what had actually happened on the ridgeline had settled into the general knowledge of the unit with the slightly self-conscious quality of information that people realized in retrospect they should have known sooner. Soldiers looked at her differently. Not dramatically. There was no ceremony to it, no sudden reversal of treatment. But the quality of attention changed. People who had previously looked past her started making eye contact. The brief nods in corridors acquired a slightly different weight. Reyes stopped her outside the chow hall on the second day and said simply, "Everyone saw the corrected report," and then looked slightly embarrassed by the sentimentality of having said it and moved on. She appreciated the restraint. What she didn't appreciate, what she noticed with the particular clarity of someone who had spent 7 years learning to read institutional atmospheres, was that the formal adjustment to her record had not actually changed her duty assignments. She was still on the comm duty rotation, still excluded from the precision rifle training schedule. The roster cross published for the following week was structurally identical to the one that had existed before the patrol, before the shot, before the amended report, before the battalion review. Her name was in the official record now. Her name was also still penciled into the communication slot for 3 out of 5 working days. Briggs noticed it the same morning she did. He found her at the comm station at 0800 and sat in the empty seat beside her with the expression of a man who had read the same roster and reached the same conclusion. "You saw it," he said. "Hard to miss. You going to say something?" She looked at the radio in front of her. "Not yet. Whitfield's team is still here. I know. Maddox." "I know, Sergeant." She turned slightly toward him. Cross made a correction. "He hasn't made a change. Those are different things." She turned back to the radio. "I'm going to give it time to be different before I decide what to do about it being the same." Briggs held the silence for a moment. "How much time?" "Enough to be sure I'm right." He left. She ran the 0800 radio check and logged the traffic and let herself be, for the duration of the morning at least, exactly what the roster said she was, a soldier on communications duty. Because the fight she intended to have, if she had to have it, was not one she wanted to start before she was certain it was necessary. The fight started without her permission on day 5. What happened was this. A second patrol briefing was called for a reconnaissance mission into a different sector, and the briefing roster included the precision rifle section, and the name on the lead marksman slot was not hers. It was Corporal Dietz. Dietz was 26, competent, qualified, a solid marksman who had worked with the section for 8 months and had qualification scores that were respectable without being exceptional. He was a reasonable choice for a standard reconnaissance mission. He was not the person whose threat assessments had identified an active mortar position 9 days before it fired, or whose name was now in 7 places in the amended record of the most significant engagement at Kesler Station in the previous quarter. She read the roster in the hallway outside the briefing room and felt something that was not quite anger. Anger was too hot for what this was. It was colder than that. The particular cold of a person confirming a calculation they had hoped would come out differently. She went to the briefing, sat in the back, listened to the mission parameters. Said nothing. Afterward, in the hallway, Dietz caught up with her. He was young enough to still have the instinct to check whether things were okay, which was a quality she generally appreciated in people. "Sergeant Maddox." He almost stopped walking, then didn't. "I didn't ask for the lead slot." "I know you didn't. I wanted to say that." "I know, Dietz. It's fine." It wasn't exactly fine, but it was not his problem, and it was not a problem she was going to hand to someone who hadn't created it. "Be ready. That sector has some of the same terrain patterns as Sable Ridge." He looked at her. "Should I be worried about something specific?" She thought about that. Don't assume the intelligence picture is clean just because it's recent. 48-hour-old imagery missed an emplaced crew last week. Treat every approach position as potentially observed until you've assessed it personally. He nodded. He was writing it down mentally, she could tell. The kind of internal noting that young soldiers did when they received something that felt more like genuine operational knowledge than generic instruction. "Yes, Sergeant," he said, and he meant it. She walked away, turned the corner into the corridor that led toward the operations section, and stopped. Whitfield was coming out of the operations center with Okafor behind him and a folder under his arm. He saw her, stopped. "Sergeant Maddox?" He glanced at the folder. "I was actually hoping to speak with you before we departed." "Sir?" He looked up and down the corridor. "Not here. Conference room." Whitfield's team was packing up. The conference room had the aftermath look of a space that had been a working environment for several days. Papers stacked for return transport, a laptop in a padded case on the table, a coffee cup that had been there long enough to have a dried ring inside it. Okafor stayed by the door. Whitfield sat at the table. Claire took the chair across from him. "The review is concluded," Whitfield said. "The amended report will be processed at Battalion, and the preliminary intelligence submissions will be formally cross-referenced in the sector threat database." He folded his hands on the table. "There are also some personnel matters that will be handled through command channels, which I'm not in a position to detail to you, but which you should be aware are part of the outcome." "Understood, sir. What I want to say to you personally is this." He looked at her directly. "The intelligence methodology you used in the 6-week assessment series, the pattern analysis approach, I've seen that kind of thinking in S2 cells at brigade and division level. I have not routinely seen it in a patrol element's organic precision marksman." She held his gaze, didn't deflect. "Is that something you developed independently?" "Largely, sir. I had some exposure to signals analysis methodology in a joint training environment 3 years ago. I adapted the framework." "On your own initiative?" "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly. "You said in our previous conversation that the record speaks for itself. I want to tell you that it does, and that people at Battalion who are now reading that record are going to have some follow-on questions." He paused. "Not adverse questions. Different ones." He stood. The meeting was over. She stood as well. "Sir, the duty assignment question." He looked at her. "The amended report accurately reflects the engagement, but the operational deployment of this section has not changed. I'm still on communications duty 3 days out of 5, and the patrol that was just briefed has a different marksman in the lead slot." Whitfield studied her. "Have you raised that with your chain of command?" "I'm raising it with you because you're here, and the chain of command is the origin of the problem." Okafor by the door did not move, did not change his expression, was very carefully looking at a specific point on the wall. "That's a direct chain of command issue," Whitfield said. "What I can tell you is that the personnel matters I referenced include a review of section assignment practices." He picked up the folder. "If those practices don't change, the right mechanism is a formal complaint through IG channels. I'd recommend giving it a reasonable window before taking that step." He paused. "A short window." "How short, sir?" 72 hours is reasonable." He moved toward the door. "Thank you, Sergeant." She stood in the emptying conference room for a moment after they left, looked at the dried coffee ring in the abandoned cup. 72 hours. Wow. She counted them, not obsessively. She didn't mark a calendar or set an alert. She simply kept track the way she kept track of firing solutions and atmospheric conditions and pattern intervals precisely in the background, as part of the continuous running calculation that was how her mind operated in environments where precision mattered. Day 1 of the 72 hours. Nothing changed. She ran comm duty. She updated her threat assessment notes because the habit was structural by now and wouldn't survive interruption without cost. She ate in the chow hall at the normal time and exchanged the normal words with the normal people, and did not indicate in any visible way that she was counting anything. Day 2. The patrol Dietz led came back without incident. She read his debrief notes and saw that he had noted, in the terrain assessment section, that 2 approach positions showed behavioral indicators that warranted monitoring. He had used her language, behavioral indicators. She didn't know if that meant he'd understood what she told him, or just internalized her phrasing, but either way, he'd looked. That was something. Cross published the Week 3 roster on the morning of Day 2. She was on comm duty 4 days out of 5. 4 out of 5. She read the roster twice, folded it, put it in her pocket next to the printed copy of the amended report, where the 2 documents sat against each other in the dark of her cargo pocket, like 2 versions of the same story. Day 3 arrived at 0430. She was in the rain shed at 0500, running dry fire. The routine of it was not comfort exactly. She wasn't someone who took comfort in repetition for its own sake, but it was something solid in a situation that was otherwise being held together by the tension between what the record said and what the roster showed. The trigger press at the end of each dry fire rep was the one moment in every cycle where the gap between intention and reality was exactly 0. Nothing external could affect it. The sight picture was or wasn't correct. The trigger was or wasn't properly pressed. The result was or wasn't what it should be. She preferred problems that had correct answers. The operations sergeant major arrived at 0538 and stood in the doorway of the range shed, which was unusual for Valdez in several respects, including the time of day, and the fact that Valdez did not generally seek people out in informal settings. Claire lowered the rifle. "Sergeant Major, the new week's precision rifle training schedule goes out at 700, Valdez said. She was in her PT clothes, which suggested she'd come directly from her morning run, which suggested this conversation had been planned before the run was over. "I'm aware, Sergeant Major. Your name is on it." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Lead marksman slot, Thursday through Saturday instruction cycle." Valdez's voice carried the same professional neutrality it always carried, which was a tone that could mean almost anything and was designed to. "The comm rotation has been adjusted. Cross approved this?" Valdez looked at her with an expression that was very precisely the expression of a senior non-commissioned officer who has decided exactly how much information to convey and intends to convey exactly that much. "The schedule was coordinated through the operations section," she said, "which is the correct process." It wasn't a complete answer. It was also not an incomplete one. "Thank you, Sergeant Major." Valdez left. Claire stood in the range shed in the thin pre-dawn light and let that settle for a moment. The qualified, imperfect, partial movement of a thing that had been immovable. Not a resolution, not the correction she'd asked Whitfield about, but a door opened by someone who had the key and had decided, after whatever internal process Valdez ran before making decisions, that it was time to open it. She raised the rifle, completed the drill, logged it, occupied. The Thursday training cycle started at 0630, and she was there 15 minutes early, which was how she started every professional engagement she cared about. The range was the fixed distance qualification range attached to Kesler's training area. Nothing like the Sable Ridge terrain, controlled conditions, standardized distances, the kind of environment where the variables were managed rather than managed around. 3 other marksmen were scheduled for the cycle. Dietz was one of them. He arrived at 0628, looked at her, nodded, and found his position without making anything of the dynamic in the room, which she appreciated. The other 2, Specialist Gorman and Private First Class Tate, were newer to the section and had heard the story of the Ridgeline shot filtered through the informal network, which meant they'd heard parts of it accurate and parts of it inflated in the way stories inflated when they moved through units. They looked at her the way people looked at things they were trying to square with the version in their heads. She ignored that and ran the training. She had not run formal training in 14 months. Her previous posting had included it, but Kesler had not used her in that capacity. She felt the slight unfamiliarity of it, the calibration required to teach something so embedded in her own mechanics that externalizing it required translation. But the translation came back quickly, the way fluency in a language came back after time away. Not immediately perfect, but structurally intact. By the 3rd iteration of the fundamentals drill, Tate was shaving significant time off his target acquisition splits. Gorman was struggling with his trigger discipline in the final degree of press, and she walked him through it twice, physically demonstrating the muscle isolation, which was the only way she knew to communicate what was otherwise a purely internal sensation. Dates watched the instruction from his position. At the break, he came over. "You've done this before," he said. It was an observation, not a question. "Previous posting. What was your qualification score?" She looked at him. "Why?" He shrugged. "The guys at Fort Carson have a record on the precision qual. I'm trying to work out if what I heard about the Ridgeline shot is the same category of thing as the record, or if they're separate." She thought about that for a moment. Different skill sets, static qualification and dynamic field engagement aren't the same problem. "But you can do both." "I can do both." He nodded slowly. "You know, when I heard they were putting me on the patrol brief as lead, I thought it was just the rotation." He paused. "Then I heard about the amended report and the battalion review." "Dates. I'm not trying to make this weird. I just want to say that if you were supposed to be on that brief and you weren't, that was wrong. And I'm glad the record got fixed." He picked up his rifle. "And I'm taking the behavioral indicator thing seriously." She looked at him. He was 26, and he had a face that was still doing the work of learning to hide things. And in this moment, he wasn't hiding anything. just saying what he thought with the straightforward simplicity of someone who hadn't yet developed the defensive complexity that came with longer service and more disappointments. Good, she said. That's the right call. She ran the afternoon session through the complex target sequence. Multiple positions, alternating distances, atmospheric variation within the controlled range environment. Gorman fixed his trigger problem by the third set. Tate's splits came down another notch. Dietz was already solid and used the session to refine his positional transitions. At 1700, she called the day's training complete, filed the session report, walked the range equipment back to storage. In the storage room, she sat on an ammo crate for 2 minutes and did absolutely nothing. No logging, no calculation, no next step planning. Just sat. Let the day close. Let the specific exhaustion of teaching, which was a different exhaustion from shooting or running or going places that wanted to kill her, settle into its proper proportion. Then she heard boots in the corridor outside. Quick, purposeful, not the rhythm of someone just passing through. Briggs came around the corner into the storage room. His expression was the one she'd learned to read as something just happened, which was distinct from his other expressions in a way she could identify now with reasonable accuracy. "We've got a problem," he said. She stood up. "What kind?" "The kind that just came in on the secure net from Battalion." He was keeping his voice level in the way people kept their voices level when the instinct was to do something other than that. "There's movement in the Sable Ridge sector. Enemy element, estimated platoon size, and they've got crew-served weapons. Confirmed, not assessed. Confirmed." She felt the specific shift in her own attention that happened when a situation moved from institutional to operational. A clearing, a sharpening, the dropping away of everything that wasn't immediately relevant. "What's the mission?" "Interdiction. They want a precision engagement element on the ridge above the valley by first light to support the blocking force that goes in at 0400. He looked at her. Battalion specifically requested a named marksman for the interdiction position. She picked up her kit bag. "They named you," Briggs said. She stopped. "Not the section, not the designated marksman. Your name." "Cross got the request 15 minutes ago." He watched her face. He didn't hesitate. He said yes. The storage room was very quiet. Outside, the base was running its evening rhythm. Generators, vehicle movement, the faint exchange of voices from the chow hall direction. She thought about the ridgeline she'd studied for 6 weeks, the terrain above the valley she'd mapped from topographic prints and ground observation, and a set of calculations run in the dark before anyone was asking her to run them. The firing positions she'd assessed from above and below and from every angle available to her in the data she'd accumulated. She thought about the distance she'd shot before, about the fact that she had, somewhere in the back of her dope book, firing solutions for positions above the valley that she'd calculated on the same night she'd calculated the patrol engagement solution. Just in case. Just because her mind worked that way, identifying problems before they were problems, mapping solutions before they were required, keeping the answers available. "What's the element size?" she asked. "You, Briggs, and 2 from the section. 4 total." "Who's the fire support officer?" "Captain Reeves from Battalion Fires. He's inbound by helo at 2300. I need 3 hours before we step off." "You've got 4. She looked at Briggs. He had the expression of a man who was holding something back. Not bad news exactly, but the awareness of something significant that he hadn't said yet. "What?" she said. He was quiet for a second. Then, "The S2 at Battalion. When they sent the request with your name on it. The language in the request." He stopped, started again. "They described you as the battalion's most capable precision shooter. Not the section, not the unit." He met her eyes. "By name. As a named capability." She absorbed that. "That doesn't come from a corrected after-action report," Briggs said. "That comes from someone at Battalion who read everything. The preliminary assessments, the pattern analysis, the engagement record." He paused. "All of it." She stood in the storage room with her kit bag and the specific grounded weight of what that meant. Not the version of it that became pride or vindication or the complicated warmth of finally being seen, but the operational version, the version that meant the next 4 hours needed to be used well. "I need my dope book," she said. "I figured." He held it up. He'd brought it from the workstation. She took it from him, opened it to the section in the back where she had, on a sleepless night that now felt like a different chapter of something, calculated the firing solutions for elevated positions above the Sable Ridge Valley. Found the page. Read the numbers. They were still good. She'd need to run the temperature and density altitude corrections for 0400 first light conditions, which would take 20 minutes of the 4 hours she had. She closed the book. "Let's go," she said. The 4 hours went fast. She spent the first 20 minutes on the atmospheric corrections, temperature at predicted first light, density altitude adjustment for the elevated position she'd selected from the topo prints, wind behavior modeling based on the 6 weeks of ground observation data she'd accumulated. The numbers shifted slightly from her earlier calculations. Not dramatically, but precision at distance was a game of small adjustments compounding, and slightly wrong became catastrophically wrong at 1,800 meters. So she ran every correction twice and marked the final solutions in red pen in the margin of the dope book page she'd flagged. The next 40 minutes she spent on equipment checks that went beyond standard pre-operation protocol. Not because she doubted the rifle's condition after the morning's training session, but because the difference between a range environment and a pre-dawn interdiction position on a mountain ridge in cold air was the difference between controlled and uncontrolled. And the rifle needed to be ready for the second thing, not the first. She checked the scope's temperature compensation, retorqued the mount screws to spec, verified the ammunition lot consistency by weight-checking 6 rounds against the lot she'd been carrying since the previous engagement. Briggs found her at the tail end of the equipment check and watched for a moment without interrupting. "Reeves landed," he said. "He's in the operations center doing the coordination. What's his read on the enemy element? Platoon size, maybe 20 to 25 personnel. 2 crew served confirmed. 1 PKM variant, and what the overhead imagery thinks is a recoilless rifle, though the analysts have low confidence on the second identification." He sat down on a crate. "They've been in the valley for about 6 hours. The movement pattern suggests they're establishing a support by fire position for something that hasn't happened yet." She looked up. "For what?" "Unknown. That's part of what tonight's mission is supposed to answer." She went back to the ammunition check. If they've got a recoilless rifle and they're setting a support by fire position, there's a blocking force or a breach element somewhere that hasn't moved yet. They're waiting for something to start. Reeves said the same thing. "What's the blocking force timeline?" 0400 step off. We need to be on the ridge and in position by 0345 at the latest, which means we step off from here at 0100 to make the infiltration window. She finished the weight check, all 6 rounds within 2 grains of each other. Good enough. "Gorman and Tate," she said. From the training today, Gorman fixed his trigger issue by the 3rd set. Tate is fast, but he rushes his breathing on positional transitions. I'll note it. They're your security element on the ridge, not the shooters. They still need to be solid." She stood. "Has Cross said anything?" Briggs was quiet for half a second longer than the question required. "He came down to the operations center when the mission request came in. Read the battalion tasking. Read your name on it." Another pause. "He left without saying anything. Went to his office." She processed that. "Is he going to be a problem tonight?" "Tonight? No. Cross isn't going to interfere with a battalion-tasked operation." Briggs stood. "After tonight is a different question." She picked up the dope book. "After tonight is after tonight." Captain Reeves was 34 and had the compact, slightly wound-up energy of a fires officer who had spent most of his career making decisions in real time under conditions that did not reward hesitation. He met her in the operations center at 22:15 and shook her hand with the directness of someone who had already read everything he needed to read and was past the introductory phase. "Sergeant Maddox, I read your preliminary assessments from the sector database, the Fourier analysis on the movement patterns." "Sir? I want to know something." He looked at her without preamble. "The shot on the ridgeline, the 1,840-meter engagement, was that inside your actual capability, or was it a low percentage attempt because there were no other options?" She looked at him. She appreciated the question. Most people wouldn't have asked it that directly. "Both," she said. "It was inside my capability. It was also a low percentage attempt relative to controlled conditions. At that range, atmospheric variables and target behavior can generate misses at a rate that most commanders wouldn't accept in a planned engagement." She paused. "But it was more probable than letting the crew fire." He nodded, like she'd confirmed something. "What's your range tonight?" "Depends on where they emplace. Based on the imagery, I'm estimating between 1,200 and 1,600 meters from the position I've selected on the ridge. More manageable than last week. You've pre-selected a position? I pre-selected 3. Primary, alternate, contingency. I've mapped the engagement geometry from each one. I have firing solutions calculated for all 3 against the area where the enemy element appears to be establishing. Reeves looked at Briggs, then back at her. You did this before you received tonight's mission tasking. I did it the same night I calculated the solutions for the Valley Patrol. I was working through the terrain comprehensively. He absorbed that. Why? She thought about how to answer that. Because the terrain was there, she said, and I don't like leaving problems I can see. They stepped off at 01:05 in the coldest part of the night, when the temperature at the base had dropped to the point where breath fogged and condensation had settled on every metal surface. 4 people, Claire, Briggs, Gorman, Tate, moving in the dark up the ridgeline approach she'd identified from the topo prints, which turned out to match the ground with enough fidelity that she only needed one route adjustment at the 40-minute mark where a drainage feature was deeper than the contour lines suggested. The movement was hard. The terrain was steep and the footing was unstable in the dark, and there was no tactical illumination because they were maintaining light discipline, which meant navigating by natural starlight filtered through high cloud cover that was present but not dense enough to eliminate their ability to move. Claire moved on point, reading the ground through a combination of her own familiarity with the terrain analysis she'd done and the practiced instinct of someone who had spent years learning to feel what the ground was doing under her feet. At 03:18, they reached the primary position. It was a rock shelf on the ridge's eastern face, a natural depression that provided concealment from below, a stable platform for the rifle, and clear sight lines across the valley floor to the area where the enemy element had been assessed. The cold up here was different from the cold at the base, thinner, more direct, with a wind component that she had factored into her calculations and would need to keep monitoring because ridgeline winds shifted in ways that valley winds didn't. She set up without speaking. Briggs and Gorman took the security positions without instruction. They'd briefed the positioning at the operations center, and everyone knew where they were going. Tate covered the eastern approach. She settled into the position, got her eye behind the scope, let herself go through the orientation sequence she'd rehearsed, identify reference points, confirm range estimates against known terrain features, assess current wind by observing the natural indicators available. The valley below was dark and still, but still in the way that things were still when they were full of people who were trying not to be heard. She keyed the radio. Maddox at primary, set. How's the blocking force? Reeves's voice came back quiet and close. Blocking force at SP on timeline. Any update on enemy disposition? Last confirmed position 42 minutes ago was in your 12 o'clock, approximately 1,350 meters. No significant movement since. She found the area in the scope. Dark, scrub, and rock and the uneven floor of the valley. Nothing visible. She would not expect anything visible. A platoon-sized element that had been in position for several hours would have gone to ground by now, weapons covered, personnel distributed and the concealment available. She waited. Waiting was the job. Most people understood shooting as the job, and shooting was what the job produced. But the actual job was waiting in a way that kept you present enough to respond in the fraction of a second that mattered, while keeping you regulated enough not to manufacture triggers where none existed. She had gotten good at it over 7 years in the same way she'd gotten good at everything else, by doing it until the doing required less conscious effort than the not doing. At 03:47, the valley started waking up. She heard it before she saw it, a change in the valley's acoustic profile. A subtle increase in the frequency of small sounds that weren't quite identifiable but added up to movement. Then a brief flash of a shielded light source, gone in under a second, the kind of light you used to check a reference point and killed immediately after. Contact, she said quietly into the radio. Movement, valley floor, bearing 273. Single light source, momentary. Element is repositioning. Blocking force is 8 minutes from line of departure, Reeves said. 8 minutes. Which meant 8 minutes before the valley floor was going to become an active engagement environment, and whatever was down there would stop trying to stay concealed and start trying to fight. She tracked the area where the light had appeared. Let her eyes work the darkness with the accumulated knowledge of what was there from the imagery, from the acoustic data, from the pattern of movement she was building in real time. The PKM appeared first. She identified it by the profile, the distinctive outline of a crew-served weapon being repositioned for an engagement, the shape of the bipod and the barrel silhouetted briefly against the slightly lighter surface of a rock face behind it. 1,310 meters, slightly left of center in her engagement area. Crew served, bearing 271, estimated 1,310 meters, PKM variant. Crew of 2 visible. Copy, hold. She held. The blocking force made contact at 0401, 3 minutes behind timeline, which was close enough to on time in the real world. The sound of it reached her ridge position a second after it happened. A sharp, short exchange of fire from the valley's northern entrance, the sound compressed by terrain into something that was more impact than noise. Below her, the valley floor became movement, not panic, a trained element responding to contact, personnel moving to fighting positions, the PKM crew swinging the weapon to orient on the contact. She tracked the crew, found the gunner, let him settle into position, which was the moment when a crew-served weapon crew was most dangerous and also most predictable, committed to the weapon, anchored to the position. PKM crew is engaging. No one told her to. She said it because she was going to do it and the radio was there to inform, not to ask. The shot was cleaner than the ridgeline shot. Shorter distance, better position, conditions within her calculated parameters rather than at their edge. She pressed the trigger, rode the recoil back onto the target, observed. The gunner went down. The assistant gunner was up and moving in 2 seconds, pulling at the weapon, trained to recover the crew served, not to run, which meant he stayed in the area and she was already working the second adjustment. She fired again. The assistant gunner went down behind cover, not dropped. She couldn't confirm an effect from the scope at night, but out of the fight, unable to operate the weapon from the position he'd rolled to. PKM crew neutralized. Weapon appears out of action. Copy, Reeves said. Blocking force has contact with the main element. Where's the second crew served? She was already looking. The recoilless rifle, if that's what it was, had not appeared, which meant it was either not emplaced yet or in place somewhere her current sightlines didn't cover, or the imagery identification had been wrong and it wasn't there. All three were live possibilities, and she needed to work them in order. No contact on second crew served from primary. Moving to alternate. Copy. Do not expose yourself to the valley floor during movement. Understood. She came off the primary position. Briggs was beside her immediately. No instruction needed, already oriented to the movement she needed to make, to the alternate position 40 meters along the ridge and 8 meters lower. Gorman and Tate covered the displacement, which was the right call, and nobody said anything because there was nothing to say that the situation hadn't already communicated. The alternate position was a harder setup. The rock formation that provided concealment also constrained her angle, and she spent 90 seconds working through the limitation before finding the window that gave her what she needed. The angle to the southern sector of the valley opened up, which was the area the primary position hadn't fully covered. She found the recoilless rifle 18 seconds later. It was set back further than the imagery had suggested, 1,480 meters from her current position, in a depression that would have been invisible from the imagery angle, but was marginally visible from the ridge elevation. The crew was 3 personnel. 1 was on the weapon. The other 2 were handling a round. Second crew served located, bearing 268, 1,480 meters. Recoilless rifle, crew of 3. They are loading. Blocking force is engaged with the main element. If that recoilless fires into the valley entrance, the blocking force is in the impact zone. She was already settled. Engaging. The round took 1.9 seconds to travel 1,480 meters. She watched the crew commander go down. The remaining 2 crew members scrambled. 1 ran. 1 attempted to return to the weapon and she fired again, and he went down behind the weapon, hard, not moving. The remaining crew member was running. She tracked him. He was not on the weapon. She held. 2 crew served out of action, she said. The valley below was noise and movement, and the particular quality of a firefight that was in the process of resolving, sporadic rather than sustained, the rhythm of a force that was losing cohesion rather than a force that was holding. Reeves's blocking force pressed from the north. The valley's southern exit was the terrain's only real option for exfil, which was where the enemy element went, in groups and individually. And she watched them move without firing because they were moving away from the engagement rather than toward a weapon. By 0438, it was over. The blocking force reported contact broken at 0441. Enemy element exfiltration confirmed in 3 groups via the southern drainage channel. 4 enemy personnel confirmed down in the valley. The crew-served weapons were still on the ground, Jiao. They had not been recovered during the exfil, which meant they would be exploited in the morning. She came off the alternate position, sat against the rock shelf with her back to the valley, rifle across her knees, and let herself breathe at a normal rate for the first time in 37 minutes. Briggs sat beside her. Not close. Close enough. You okay? He asked. She thought about giving him the standard answer. Tired, she said instead. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. Good shooting. It was closer than last week. That's not a complaint. No. She looked at the sky, which was beginning its grudging pre-dawn lightening. It's not. But what? The return movement took 2 hours and 15 minutes on terrain that was harder going downhill in the early light than it had been going uphill in the dark, which was a fact about mountains that always surprised people until they'd done it enough times. They reached Kesler Station at 0720 and were met at the wire by Valdez, which was unusual enough that Claire noted it as a data point without immediately knowing what it meant. Good morning, Sergeant Major. Sergeant Maddox. Valdez fell in alongside her toward the operations center. The Battalion S3 has been monitoring the operation on the net. Colonel Mercer was in the S3 at 0415. Claire processed that. Colonel Mercer was battalion commander, the kind of officer who did not sit in on tactical operations at 0415 in the morning, unless the operation had come to his personal attention in a way that warranted his personal presence. He has questions for you, Valdez said. When? 0900. It was 7:23. I need 2 hours, Claire said. You have 2 hours and 4 minutes. She showered and ate and changed into a clean uniform and spent the remaining 40 minutes updating her engagement log with the full sequence: bearing, range, wind estimate, round count, result assessment, timeline. She logged it the way she always logged everything, with enough precision that a stranger reading it 6 months from now would understand exactly what had happened and why each decision had been made when it was made. She also, for the first time in a week, opened the back cover of the dope book and reread the 9 names on the piece of paper Reyes had given her. Then she put the book in her cargo pocket and walked to the operations center. Colonel Mercer was 62 years old and had a face that had been doing serious things for long enough that it had settled into a permanent baseline of serious. Not unkind. The lines of it ran toward competence rather than hardness. He was sitting in the conference room with his S3, a lieutenant colonel named Park, and Captain Reeves, who had beaten them back to the base by helicopter and still looked like a man running on operational adrenaline and not much else. Cross was also in the room. He was sitting along the wall rather than at the table, the position of a person who was present but not at the center of the proceeding, which told her something about how the morning had already organized itself. She came to attention. At ease, Sergeant Maddox. Mercer's voice was the kind of low that carried without effort. Sit down. She sat. I want to go through this morning's operation sequentially, Mercer said. I was monitoring the net from S3. I heard your transmissions. I want to hear it directly from you. She went through it. Chronologically, without embellishment, the position selection, the observation timeline, the PKM identification, the 2 engagements on that crew, the movement to the alternate position, the recoilless rifle identification, the engagement sequence there. She gave the information the way she gave all information, as precisely as the data supported, no more, no less. Mercer listened without interrupting. Park took notes. Reeves confirmed the timeline at 2 points where the radio record and her verbal account needed to be reconciled. When she finished, Mercer was quiet for a moment. The second crew served, he said. The recoilless rifle crew. You engaged when they were loading. Yes, sir. Why not wait for confirmation of fire intent? The blocking force was in the impact zone of a recoilless rifle engagement at that range, sir. Confirmation of fire intent in that context is the crew completing the loading sequence and the gunner acquiring. By that point, the round is approximately 3 seconds from impact. She paused. I engaged when the threat was confirmed, not when it was declared. He looked at her for a moment. Difference between those two things. The threat was confirmed when I identified the weapon type and observed active loading. Fire declaration would have required them to actually fire. She held his gaze. I wasn't willing to wait for the declaration. And the runner you held fire on. He was no longer on a crew-served weapon and was moving away from the engagement. He was no longer a priority threat. Mercer nodded. Not the performative nod of a person processing what they expected to hear, but the more deliberate nod of someone receiving something that confirms or challenges a mental model they've been running. He turned to a folder in front of him. I've been reading your preliminary intelligence reports from the past 6 weeks, he said. The full series, not the summary. She waited. The Fourier analysis methodology. He looked up. Where did you train in intelligence analytics? Formally? I haven't, sir. He looked at her with the expression of a person who has just heard something that requires recalibration. You developed this independently. I had exposure to signals intelligence methodology in a joint training environment approximately 3 years ago. I adapted the framework to behavioral pattern analysis on my own initiative. Mercer leaned back, looked at Park, who had stopped writing and was looking at Claire with an expression she couldn't fully read but that had none of the blank professional neutrality of a note-taker doing their job. Sergeant Maddox, Mercer said. How long have you been in the Army? 7 years, sir. What was your previous posting? She told him. Fort Drummond, Precision Rifle Section, 2 years. Before that, a tour in a different theater with a unit she named and the room recognized, which produced a brief shift in Reeves's expression that indicated he was running a specific recognition through his memory. That unit, Reeves said. What was your role? Precision engagement. I also ran the pattern analysis component of the pre-mission intelligence package for the section. They had you running intelligence analysis and shooting? Informally. The section leader recognized that the capability was there and used it. She paused. It wasn't on my job description. Mercer looked at Cross. It was the first time since she'd entered the room that the dynamic explicitly included Cross, and the look Mercer gave him was not a long one, but it had weight. Cross held it without looking away, which she gave him credit for. Lieutenant Cross, Mercer said, you received Sergeant Maddox's preliminary assessment series, 6-week threat analysis. Did you review those documents? No, sir. Cross's voice was flat, honest. I logged them and ensured transmission to S2. I did not personally review them. Why not? Cross was quiet for a beat. I had formed an assessment of the section's capability that didn't accurately account for the full range of what Sergeant Maddox brought to the section, sir. My review prioritization reflected that incomplete assessment. That incomplete assessment cost you 14 iterations of designated marksman and an after-action report that Battalion had to correct, Mercer said. Yes, sir. And it almost cost you 12 soldiers and a crew-served weapon engagement that this sergeant identified 9 days before it happened. Yes, sir. Cross. Mercer's voice had not changed in volume or tone, but something underneath it had changed. This is going to be addressed through your evaluation. I want that understood. Understood, sir. I also wanted understood that what you did this morning when the battalion request came in, when I named Sergeant Maddox specifically and you approved the mission tasking without hesitation, that's noted too. He paused. Both things are noted. Cross said nothing. The wall behind him was very still. Mercer turned back to Claire. Captain Foss, he said. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. You're aware of the intelligence assessment issue identified in the battalion review. I'm aware that the preliminary intelligence product was summarized in a way that removed a key caveat, sir. Foss is being reassigned. His work here is done. Mercer said it without particular emphasis, the way you said things that had already been decided and didn't require discussion. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, regardless of whatever calculations you're running about how the answer looks. Sir, if you had been in an intelligence officer role on this patrol, if you had been empowered to brief your own analysis rather than submitting it to a chain that didn't read it, how different would the outcome have been? She thought about that carefully. Not the answer, The answer she knew. She was thinking about whether the answer was useful or whether it was just true. The patrol route would have been modified before step-off, she said. The threat would have been briefed as active rather than assessed. We would have had a fire support plan in place and a contingency for crew-served engagement before we entered the low ground. She paused. We still would have taken the shot, but we would have been ready for it before it was the only option. The room held that. That's what I thought you'd say, Mercer said. He closed the folder. I'm going to ask you something else. There's a program at Battalion that cross-trains selected precision shooters in tactical intelligence methodology. It's been running for about 18 months. 3 slots are currently open. He looked at her directly. Would you be interested in a formal program of that kind? She held herself still. Yes, sir. It would mean a temporary duty assignment change. You'd be at Battalion for 8 weeks. I understand, sir. He nodded. There are some logistics, rank considerations. The methodology program is typically entered at a certain grade. He glanced at Park, who was already writing something. We'll sort that out. She didn't ask what sorting it out meant. Not in this room, not right now. Mercer stood. The room stood. She stood. Sergeant Maddox. He extended his hand across the table. Good work this morning. Good work last week. Good work for 6 weeks before anyone was paying attention. She shook his hand. Thank you, sir. He left with Park. Reeves followed after a brief nod in her direction. The nod of a person who recognized a peer, which was a different thing from the nod of a senior acknowledging a subordinate, and she noticed the difference. Cross remained. They were alone in the conference room for the first time since the operation had changed everything and the conversation in his office had half changed something else. He was still along the wall. He stood with his arms at his sides and his expression doing the complicated work of a man who was not good at this kind of moment, but was trying to be present for it rather than retreating into his rank. I owe you more than a corrected report, he said. She looked at him. I had a picture of who you were, he said, and I built everything on the picture instead of the actual person. And the gap between those two things, he stopped. People could have died because of that gap. They didn't, she said. They almost did. Almost and did are different categories, sir. She said it without softening it, but also without putting any blade in it. Just the statement, accurate, the way she stated everything. What I need from you going forward, if we're still working together, is not contrition. It's actually looking at what's in front of you before you decide what it is. He absorbed that. That's fair? It's not about fair. It's about operational effectiveness. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that was doing real work rather than performing itself. You know, I came into this posting thinking the section needed standardization, consistent capability across all positions. What I understood by that was bringing everyone up to a common level. That's not wrong. But it's also not right if the common level is the ceiling and you're already through the ceiling. He shook his head slightly. I was standardizing down without realizing it. She didn't say anything to that because it was accurate, and he'd said it himself, and sometimes the only useful response to a person correctly identifying their own failure was to let the identification stand. Mercer is going to address the evaluation, Cross said. I want you to know I'm not going to push back on that. I didn't think you would, sir. I also want you to know, he stopped, started again. The battalion program, the cross-training. If that's where this is going, I'll support the paperwork, whatever it requires. She looked at him. He was not comfortable, and he was not pretending to be comfortable, and he was doing the thing anyway, which was the only version of this she had any use for. Thank you, sir, she said. He left. She stood in the conference room alone for a moment. The empty table, the coffee ring that was still there from Whitfield's team, the window that looked out onto the base's main vehicle route where a truck was pulling slowly out of the motor pool. Her hands were steady. She realized, very hungry. She had eaten before the 0900 meeting, but the operational adrenaline from the night and the sustained tension of the debrief had burned through everything quickly. And what was left on the other side of all of it was the simple, functional demand of a body that had been running hard and needed fuel. She walked out of this conference room and down the corridor and out into the mid-morning that had the flat, clear quality of a day that had already had more in it than most days accumulated by noon. Reyes was outside the ops center, sitting on a sandbag wall, eating from a container of something from the chow hall with the focused efficiency of a man who had been awake too long and had finally found something to do about it. He looked up when she came out. "Sergeant Maddox." "Reyes." "Word is Mercer was in there." He said it without the interrogative lift. Not a question, more a careful opening. Word travels fast. "This is a small base." He looked down at his food. "Is it good news?" She considered the question. Good news was a category she applied carefully because it implied a resolution that she had learned rarely arrived cleanly. What was true was that some things had shifted. Some records had been corrected. Some doors had moved that had been closed. Some people who had decided she wasn't worth reading had read her and found something they hadn't expected and were doing something about it. Whether that was good news or just the long-delayed arrival of accuracy, she wasn't entirely sure the difference mattered. "It's accurate news," she said. Reyes looked at her. Thought about that. Nodded slowly like he was filing it somewhere it would be useful. She went inside to find something to eat. Behind her, the base ran its mid-morning rhythm. Vehicles, radio checks, the distant sound of the range that was always somewhere in the background at a place like this. The sound of a place that kept going regardless of what any individual person inside it did, and that would keep going after she was gone, and that had been going before she arrived. She had been trying to make a dent in it for 7 years. Somewhere in the last week and a half, she thought, she might have finally made one. The chow hall was half empty at that hour, caught between the breakfast crowd and the lunch cycle, which meant she could find a corner table without negotiating for space. She got eggs and toast and coffee that had been sitting too long and sat down and ate without looking at her phone or her notebook or anything else. Just ate. Let her body do the simple thing it needed to do. It took 11 minutes. She counted without meaning to. Afterward, she sat with the coffee, bad as it was, and let herself be still in a way she hadn't been still in a week and a half. Not the controlled stillness of a sniper position, which was a kind of active stillness, loaded and directed. This was different. The stillness of a person who has been running a calculation for a long time and has finally received the last variable and can let the equation close. It didn't feel like triumph. She had expected it might, in the abstract way you anticipated feelings before they arrived, and then reality showed up with its actual texture, and it was quieter than that. More like the end of a sustained physical effort, the moment when you stop and your body begins the long process of catching up with everything you've asked it to do. She was still sitting there when Briggs came in, got coffee, and sat across from her without asking if she wanted company. He'd long since established that asking was unnecessary. "How'd it go?" he said. "Mercer offered me the battalion cross-training program." Briggs wrapped both hands around his mug. "The Intel methodology track." "Yes." 8 weeks TDY. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You gonna take it?" "Yes." "Good." He said it simply. No inflation, no ceremony. The word of a man who thought it was the right answer and didn't feel the need to editorialize about why. He drank his coffee, set the mug down. "Boss is out." "Mercer told me. Cross's evaluation is getting flagged." "He told me that too." "Cross know that you know?" "We talked after Mercer left." Briggs looked at her. "How was that?" She thought about Cross in the conference room with his arms at his sides and his imperfect apology and the sentence about standardizing down that had landed accurately because he'd constructed it himself rather than having it handed to him. "Honest," she said. Uncomfortable for him, but honest. Briggs turned his mug in a slow half circle on the table. "You know, I've served with a lot of officers. Some of them were wrong the way Cross was wrong. Most of them never said anything like what you're describing." He paused. "That's worth something." "I know it is." "Does it change anything?" She considered that. "It changes what I think he's capable of. It doesn't change what happened." Briggs nodded. "Fair enough." They sat for another few minutes in the comfortable silence of two people who'd been through enough together that silence didn't require filling. Outside the chow hall windows, the base ran its late morning operations. Vehicle movement, a detail crossing the motor pool, the distant sound of a radio check from somewhere near the wire. "Mercer said something about rank considerations," Claire said. Briggs looked up. "For the program entry, He said the cross-training track is typically entered at a certain grade. She looked at her coffee. He didn't say what he meant by that. I think he meant what it sounds like. She looked at him. Promotion board results come down in 3 weeks, Briggs said. Your packet went forward before all of this. But your packet also has 7 years of record in it, and Mercer's been at Battalion long enough to know which packets are worth looking at a second time. He held her gaze. That's not a guarantee. That's a read on the situation. She said nothing. You've been a staff sergeant for 4 years, Briggs said. I'm aware of how long I've been a staff sergeant. I'm saying you should be a sergeant first class. I'm saying there's no good argument in your record for why you aren't, and there's a very clear argument in the last 2 weeks for why you should be. He picked up his mug. That's all. She looked at the table, at the worn surface of it, the ring stains from 1,000 mugs, the scratches that accumulated on every flat surface in a place like this, from the daily friction of people passing through. I'm not counting on it, she said. You shouldn't count on it, Briggs agreed, but you should stop acting like it's impossible. The week that followed had the quality of an aftermath, the institutional version of the silence after a loud sound, where everything was technically the same as before, but the air had a different pressure. The base ran its cycles. Patrols went out. Reports came in. The operations center maintained its rhythm. What was different was small and specific and real. She was on the precision rifle training schedule 5 days a week. No comm duty. The section she ran training for was now 5 shooters, Dietz, Gorman, Tate, and 2 additions from the incoming rotation who had been assessed into the section based on qualification scores and sent directly to her training cycle. Cross had approved both additions without comment through the administrative process. She ran the sessions the way she ran everything, methodically, without performance, focused on the gap between where each shooter was and where the problem would eventually require them to be. Gorman's trigger issue was fully resolved by day 3 of the second week. Tate's breathing problem was more persistent. It was structural. A tension pattern he'd developed at some point that lived in his shoulders and translated into his respiratory cycle, and unwinding it required repetition at a level that would take months rather than days. She told him that directly without softening it. How long? He asked. Months, she said. Maybe 3, maybe 6. Depends on how much dry fire you're willing to do outside of scheduled training. He looked at her with the expression of a 22-year-old weighing whether the answer was discouraging or clarifying. What's the drill? She showed him the drill. He wrote it down. He was in the range shed at 0500 the next morning, which was earlier than she'd told him to start, which told her something useful about him. Dietz came to her on the 4th day with a question that surprised her. Can I show you something? He pulled up a sketch he'd done of the terrain in the sector where his last patrol had operated. A rough but competent hand-drawn map with annotations about movement patterns he'd observed, timing variations in the activity at 2 specific locations. I used your framework, he said. The behavioral pattern thing. I don't know if I did it right. She looked at the sketch, looked at the annotations. They were unrefined. He didn't have the background to structure the analysis formally, but the instinct was right. He'd looked at the right things and drawn the right initial inferences. You did it right, she said. The formalization is something you'd learn in a structured program. But the instinct is there. He looked slightly relieved. There's a location here. He pointed to a spot on the sketch that I think warrants monitoring. I wanted to submit an observation report, but I wasn't sure if that was overstepping. It's not overstepping. That's the job. She handed the sketch back. Write it up and submit it through S2. Include your methodology. Whatever framework you use to reach the conclusion, document it. Even if it's informal, especially if it's informal. The formal version of what you're doing is what the intelligence shop does with computers and databases. The informal version is what gets done on the ground when someone's actually paying attention to the terrain. She paused. Both matter. The ground version sometimes matters more. He wrote up the report. She reviewed it before he submitted it. The terrain assessment at the location he'd flagged was logged and transmitted, and 3 days later confirmed by aerial reconnaissance as a site of low-level activity warranting monitoring. Dietz didn't say anything about it to her directly. He didn't need to. The acknowledgement was in the way he carried himself in the training sessions after that. The small, specific confidence of a person who has tested a skill in the real world and found it works. The TDY orders for the battalion program came down on a Thursday morning, 16 days after the Sable Ridge operation. She was at her workstation when Valdez set the printed orders on the desk beside her keyboard, in the same quiet, unannounced way she had set the amended after-action report there 2 weeks earlier. The document confirmed an 8-week temporary duty assignment to battalion headquarters, beginning in 10 days, in the Tactical Intelligence Cross-Training Program, which had a longer official title that she read twice and then mentally shortened to what Briggs had called it. She picked up the orders. Read them. Set them down. Valdez was still standing there. Sergeant Major. There's an addendum, Valdez said. Claire looked at the second page. It was a memorandum from the battalion commander, Colonel Mercer, addressed to the unit's command element. The subject line read, Recognition of Significant Contribution. She read it. It was a formal letter of commendation attached to her permanent record. It cited the preliminary intelligence assessment series, the engagement at 1,840 meters during the initial patrol, and the dual crew-served neutralization during the interdiction operation. It used her name 11 times. It used the phrase exceptional analytical capability, and it used the phrase valor under fire, and it used neither of them in ways that felt inflated, which was the mark of a document written by someone who had read the underlying record and understood what they were commending. The last paragraph noted that the commendation was being forwarded to the promotion board with a recommendation for accelerated consideration. She set the memorandum down. Valdez, she said. Her voice was level. She was making it level. Sergeant Maddox. Did you know about this before today? Valdez's expression was the one she always had. The composed, withheld face of a woman who processed enormous amounts of information and released it in measured portions. I was involved in the documentation review. That's not what I asked. A pause. Yes, I knew. Claire looked at the memorandum, at her name on it, at the 11 instances of her name in a document that was now part of the permanent record. Thank you, she said, for the records review, for pulling the submission logs. That was routine records maintenance. Valdez. The older woman looked at her. Thank you, Claire said again. Valdez held her gaze for a moment with an expression that had something very specific behind its professional surface. The particular look of a woman who had watched the same thing happen to other people over 16 years and had decided a long time ago that the correct response was not to complain about the injustice, but to maintain the mechanisms that eventually corrected it. Don't thank me, Valdez said. Do good work. She left. Claire sat with the two documents for another few minutes. The orders and the memorandum. The technical permission to go somewhere new and the formal acknowledgement of how she'd gotten there. She put both in her cargo pocket, next to the folded note with 9 names on it. The night before she was supposed to leave for battalion, she ran one more session in the range shed. Not for training, not for any operational purpose. Just for herself, because the range shed at 0500 had been the space where the last 7 years of her professional life had made the most sense. The one consistent environment where what she could do was not subject to anyone else's assessment of what she was allowed to do. Where the target didn't know or care about her gender or her rank or the fact that the man in charge of her section had decided she should be on comm duty. Where the result of the work was either correct or it wasn't, and no amount of institutional friction could change which one it was. She ran the dry fire sequence, the full protocol, positional transitions, target acquisition, trigger discipline, follow-through. An hour of it, without rushing, without thinking about battalion or the program or the memorandum in her pocket. Just the rifle and the target and the accumulated 7 years of repetition that had built the capability that had saved 12 people and then done it again and would do it again after that, somewhere she couldn't predict yet. She was on the last sequence when Cross appeared in the doorway. She saw him in her peripheral vision and finished the trigger press before she lowered the rifle. He was in his PT clothes, which meant he'd been running. His face had the post-exercise openness that stripped some of the command presence away and left something less guarded behind it. Heard you leaving, he said. Quarters are close. Sorry for the noise. You're not sorry. He said it without edge, just accurate. She set the rifle on the cleaning mat. No. He came in a few steps, stopped. He was doing the thing he'd been doing since the conference room. The thing that looked like discomfort but was actually the work of a person trying to be present without the armor of rank. "How's the training cycle going?" he said. The section. "Gorman's trigger problem is resolved. Tate is working on a structural issue that'll take time. Dietz flagged a terrain feature last week that Ariel confirmed 3 days later." Cross blinked. Dietz did. He used an informal version of the behavioral pattern methodology. The instinct is there. She paused. "You have good people in this section." "I know." He looked at the target downrange. "I didn't always know that, but I know it now." She started breaking down the rifle, the familiar sequence of disassembly that her hands ran without instruction. "Maddox." He said it without the rank prefix, which was slightly unusual. She kept working. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer like you would answer anyone, not like you're answering your commanding officer." She looked up. "Did you always know this was going to work out?" She thought about that. The honest version of the answer was complicated, and she didn't simplify it. "No," she said. There were nights where I genuinely didn't know if it was going to matter, whether any of it was going to go anywhere or whether it was going to be another posting where I did everything right and it disappeared into the system." He was quiet. "The 6 weeks before the patrol," she said, "I submitted those reports and they went into a log and nothing happened. And I kept preparing anyway, because I couldn't not, because the terrain was what it was and the threat was real regardless of whether anyone was listening. But there was a version of events where the patrol never went near that valley, or where it went there and nothing happened and the reports just sat in the log forever and I never got to find out if the analysis was right." She set the bolt assembly down. "That version is real too, but it didn't happen. It didn't happen, but it was possible." Cross stood in the rain shed looking at that truth with the expression of a man who was understanding something that lived outside the organizational charts and the evaluation systems and the formal mechanisms of military recognition. Something about what it cost a person to keep doing the right thing in the sustained absence of evidence that the right thing was going to matter. "What kept you going?" he said. She looked at the rifle components on the mat, at the dope book open beside them, at the bronze brush she still needed to replace. "The math was right," she said. "The threat was there whether or not anyone believed it. What I was doing was accurate, and accuracy it's not a choice for me. It's just how I operate." She paused. "And I'd rather be right in a record that nobody reads than wrong in one that everybody does." He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I'm going to miss having you in the section." It was a simple sentence, not elaborated, not qualified. She looked at him and he wasn't performing anything, just standing in the rain shed in his PT clothes at an hour when most people were asleep, saying a true thing. "I'll be back in 8 weeks, she said. "The section will be different in 8 weeks. "Good different." He almost smiled. "Yeah." He moved toward the door, stopped. "I mean it. What I said in the conference room. I'm not going to do it again. Not to anyone." She looked at him directly. "I know," she said. He left. She sat in the rain shed for a few more minutes, finishing the cleaning routine, and the quiet of the base at that hour settled around her. The generators, the distant wire, the specific quality of a place where people were resting before the next thing required them to be ready. She closed the dope book, picked up the rifle, put everything in its place. The ceremony was not what she had expected. She had expected, if she had expected anything, a handshake and a set of orders, and the administrative completion of a process that had already played out in conference rooms and memorandums. What she had not expected was the base formation at 0800 on the morning of her departure. The entire unit assembled in the open ground beside the operations center, with the flat early light hitting everything at a low angle that made the dust in the air visible and the mountains behind the base very sharp against the sky. Mercer was there. He had driven up from Battalion the night before, which she had not been told. Cross stood the unit at ease, and then at attention when Mercer stepped forward. Mercer was not a man who made things bigger than they were. His presence was sufficient without amplification, and when he spoke, his voice carried without effort across the formation. He read the commendation aloud, all of it. Her name 11 times in the morning air in front of every soldier at Kesler Station. The preliminary intelligence series, and the 6 weeks of documentation, and the 1,840-meter engagement, and the interdiction operation and the assessment methodology that had been developed independently and applied with enough rigor to hold up under battalion-level review. She stood in the front of the formation and looked at a point above the mountains and kept her face professionally composed and let the words land where they landed. When Mercer pinned the commendation to her uniform, he leaned in slightly and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "The promotion board results come down in 11 days. Be ready for what you find." She said, "Yes, sir." He stepped back. The formation held. And then something happened that she had not expected and would not have predicted. From somewhere in the middle of the formation, someone started to clap. Then another person. Then it moved through the unit the way things move through groups of people who are feeling the same thing simultaneously, and one person gives the rest permission to show it. Not the polite, rhythmic applause of a ceremony, but the irregular, sustained kind that comes from something genuine. She looked at the formation, at Gorman with his fixed trigger discipline, at Tate, who was in the range shed at 0500 running the drill she'd shown him, at Reyes, who had brought her a folded piece of paper with 9 names on it on a night when the system had been very quiet about what she'd done. Dates was 3 positions from the left. He was clapping, and he was looking at her, and his face had the expression of someone 26 years old who was filing a memory he intended to keep. She nodded once, a small, direct nod that communicated what she wanted to communicate and nothing else. Cross was to the side. He was clapping too. She looked at him, and he looked back, and neither of them looked away for a moment. And in that moment, something passed between them that was not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness was too clean a word for something this complicated, but was an acknowledgement that the distance between what he had been and what he was becoming was real, and that it had cost something on both sides to cross. He gave her a nod. She gave him one back. The vehicle to Battalion left at 0930. She put her kit in the back and climbed into the passenger seat and pulled the door shut, and the base moved behind her as the vehicle went down the approach road toward the valley route. And she watched it through the side mirror until the buildings got small and the ridge line swallowed the sight of it. In her left cargo pocket, the TDY orders, the commendation memorandum, and a folded piece of paper with 9 names on it. In her right cargo pocket, the dope book, its covers worn soft from handling, the interior dense with 7 years of range data and atmospheric corrections and personal notes, and on one page near the back, a set of calculations run at 0300 on a night when nobody was asking for them yet. Calculations that had turned out to matter enormously. She put her head back against the seat and watched the mountains go by. The driver, a young private named Castillo, who had been at Kesler for 2 weeks and had no particular context for who was sitting in his passenger seat, said, "Long drive, Sergeant, about 4 hours." "That's fine," she said. "You want music?" She thought about it. "Whatever you usually play." He put something on, something she didn't recognize, a genre she had no specific relationship with, someone's voice over a rhythm that was steady without being insistent. It filled the cab without demanding anything. She let it. The road wound down out of the mountain terrain, and the air changed, warmer, lower, different in the way air at different altitudes was different, a change you felt before you consciously noticed it. The valley below opened up, and then the road straightened, and the mountains behind them became background and then became distance, and then became the place where the last 7 weeks had happened. She thought about what came next. The cross-training program. 8 weeks of formal methodology instruction that would put a framework around what she'd been doing informally for 3 years. The language of intelligence analysis, the tools, the systematic version of the pattern recognition that had lived in her notebooks as scratch and intuition. She didn't know what she didn't know about it yet, which was the only interesting starting position. She thought about the formation, the 11 times her name had been said in the morning air. She thought about Martinez in the second position of the file on the day of the first patrol, with an 8-month-old daughter he hadn't met yet, who had gone home and presumably was meeting her now. She thought about Tate in the rain shed at 0500. She thought about the bronze brush she still hadn't replaced. She thought about the 2.7 seconds. The vehicle moved through the late morning landscape, and Castillo drove with the easy competence of someone who knew this road, and the music played and the mountains fell further behind. At the 3-hour mark, Castillo said, "What's it like up there, Kesler?" She looked at the road ahead, thought about how to answer that. "Hard," she said, "and worth it." He nodded. satisfied with that, and didn't ask anything else. She looked out the window and watched the terrain change and let herself be, for the first time in a long time, a person moving towards something rather than a person holding position against the current. 8 weeks later, she came back to Kesler Station with a certificate, a different understanding of her own methodology, and a set of additional qualification marks in her record that would take someone with access several minutes to fully read. She also came back as Sergeant First Class Claire Maddox, which she had been for 11 days, having received the promotion board results on a Tuesday morning in the battalion headquarters, while she was in the middle of a classroom exercise on source evaluation, and having read the notification on her phone, looked at it for approximately 10 seconds, and put the phone back in her pocket and returned her attention to the exercise. The instructor had noticed. Good news or bad news? Good news, she said. You want a minute? No, she said. Let's keep going. She kept going. When she came back to Kesler, the section was different the way she'd told Cross it would be. Tate's breathing problem was 60% resolved. Dates had submitted 4 observation reports in her absence, 2 of which had been confirmed and actioned by Battalion S2. Gorman had qualified at the highest level on the precision course during an assessment conducted while she was at Battalion. The section was better. Cross met her at the operations center on her first morning back. He had the look of a man who had spent 8 weeks doing the work of reconsidering some things, and was not finished but was further along than he'd been. How was the program? He said. Useful. The methodology components were what I expected. The source evaluation piece was new. I spent 3 weeks on that. 3 weeks on source evaluation. It's more complicated than it sounds. He almost smiled again. He'd been doing that more. The almost smile that had always been there and hadn't previously had the freedom to show up. The section's been asking about you, he said. I saw Deitz's reports. He submitted them through you as an informal advisor, listed you as a methodology consultant in the documentation header. She paused. He can't list me as a consultant. I was at Battalion. I know, I let it stand anyway. He said it simply, because it was accurate. She looked at him. His reports were correct. Whatever he learned from you was working. He straightened. Welcome back, Sergeant First Class. Thank you, sir. She went to find Briggs. He was in the equipment bay, going through the kind of systematic inventory that he ran at the beginning of every month because he was the kind of senior non-commissioned officer who believed that knowing exactly what you had was the foundation of knowing what you could do. He looked up when she came in, read the rank on her collar, looked back at his clipboard. Took them long enough, he said. She sat on a crate. 4 years. 4 years and change. He made a mark on the clipboard. How's the program? Good. Different from what I expected in some ways. What ways? The formal methodology is more collaborative than the informal version. The informal version is something you do alone by necessity. The formal version, you're supposed to build it with a team, feed it into a system that other people can use. Briggs put the clipboard down. You could do that here. She looked at him. What Deitz is doing, what you started with the section, that's the informal version. But you're the cross-trained analyst now. You could build the formal version here, in this unit, as part of how this section operates. He held her gaze. That's not in your job description. I know. You going to do it anyway? She thought about this bronze brush she'd finally replaced on day 2 of the program, which had been the first thing she'd ordered from supply when she got to Battalion. Thought about the dope book with its 7 years of accumulated data that had started as personal discipline and ended up as something people were formally commending. Yes, she said. He nodded, picked up the clipboard. Good, he said. It was the same word he'd used the first time, on the morning she'd been in the range shed at 0500 and he'd stood in the doorway and watched her work. Good. One word, no decoration. The word of a man who thought something was right and didn't need to expand on it. She went to the range shed, put her kit down, set the dope book on the bench, opened to a clean page, picked up a pen, wrote the date, and started the next record. 3 years after Kesler Station, Claire Maddox was running the Precision Engagement and Tactical Intelligence Integration Program at a regional training center where she worked with incoming marksmen from 4 different units, teaching them to do what she had taught herself to do. To see the terrain before it spoke, to read the pattern before it completed, to build the record so that the truth of what they knew could not be quietly filed away and ignored. She was 34. She had a reputation that had spread through the community in the way that genuine competence spread, not through self-promotion, but through the work itself leaving marks on the people who encountered it, and those people telling others, and the telling eventually becoming something institutional. She was not famous. She had no interest in famous. Foss had been reassigned to an administrative post at a stateside installation and had not returned to intelligence work. His record reflected the findings of the Battalion Review in language that was permanent and specific. Cross had received a performance evaluation that documented the initial failures and the subsequent correction with equal fidelity. He was still in uniform. He ran his section with the discipline and an equity that his soldiers talked about without knowing the full story of how he'd arrived there. He had become, through the friction of having been wrong and having to live with it, a better officer than he'd been before. Not because being wrong had reformed him automatically, but because he had chosen to let it. Briggs retired after 22 years and started a second career doing something that had nothing to do with the military and that apparently suited him. Because the one time Claire ran into someone who'd worked with him recently, the report was that he seemed genuinely content, which she thought was the right ending for a man who had spent 2 decades making sure other people were ready for things. Dietz made staff sergeant and submitted his application for the intelligence cross-training program. His methodology application letter cited the behavioral pattern framework he'd learned from an informal conversation in a training session at Kesler Station. She wrote him a recommendation. Martinez came home from that deployment and met his daughter, who was by then walking, which he described in a message he sent to the section group thread as the single most disorienting experience of his professional life, which generated the appropriate response from the rest of the section. Reyes made it to sergeant and was still in the unit when she last heard. Valdez retired as command sergeant major and was, by all accounts, exactly the same in retirement as she had been in service. Precise, measured, and reliably present in the mechanisms that corrected things that needed correcting. The note with 9 names on it was still in the back of the dope book. The dope book was on the shelf above her desk in her office at the training center, next to 3 others that had come after it, filling up the way things filled up when you kept doing the work. On her second day at the training center, she had started the same routine she'd started at every posting: range shed at 0500, dry fire protocol, full sequence. The first morning, one of the new instructors had walked by the range shed, seen the light, looked in, watched for a moment. "You're early," he said. "I'm where I need to be," she said. He nodded and kept going. She pressed the trigger, logged the rep, started the next one. The preparation no one sees is the foundation of the shot everyone remembers. What you do in the dark, before anyone is watching, is what decides who you are when the light finally finds you.